One, two, three.
Hello, friend. The Mystical American Patriots Society is transmitting to you from our secret ice fortress and laboratory high in the Swiss Alps. This is a variety program for normal sandwich-eating Americans with some concerns about living in a deranged, post-Christian technocracy. Keep your third eye on the sky and your ear to the ground as Sumo and Smokestack direct your attention to a higher dimension. Are you ready? Stand by.
A monk asked Kyogen, "How does an enlightened one return to the ordinary world?" Kyogen replied, "A broken mirror never reflects again. Fallen flowers never go back to the old branches." In 1995, Nintendo had a Legend of Zelda game called S2E002, which was only broadcast via satellite and did not contain Link, the main protagonist. Also known as How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Accept Black Santa. Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you?
I'm well. How are you doing?
Is my stuff on? Am I on? Is anything on? What am I doing?
I mean, I'm getting your sound. We're recording a show right now. I can see you.
Oh, okay. Today's show, listener, I have to preface you, may not be good.
Uh-oh.
Let's just go out there on a limb and say it. We're both tired. And the thing I want to discuss, I'm not even sure what it is. I sort of have a broad idea of it. But it's one of those where I've got like seven things floating around, and I know they're connected, but not quite how.
Do we need to hold off a day and let you develop your ideas a bit?
Maybe not. Let's see.
We can.
Let's see.
Okay.
Who knows?
Okay.
But I was thinking about, well, see, this is the problem. The Matrix movies got me thinking.
All right.
The new one. Because have you seen it? There's a new Matrix movie coming out by the new Wachowski. Because the old Wachowskis turned into women, and then one of them went away because her boobs got too big. But the other one got red dreadlocks, and that means she can still make movies.
Okay.
Because I think having dreadlocks as a tranny retains your creative ability better.
Okay.
Is that uncontroversial?
No, they insulate the brain and keep the ideas from escaping.
Yeah, like if you're a transsexual and don't have dreadlocks, I think you just end up trying to be an e-girl.
Yeah. Probably.
But if you have dreadlocks, you become a creative person. I don't think that's too controversial to say.
No, I think it's pretty well accepted by modern science.
By modern science,
yeah,
right? That because they lose all of the hormones through the scalp.
Sure. Yeah.
Like your body temperature.
It's very sensible.
So, but anyway, the new one is they still have Neo in there.
Okay.
But the other characters have been either fully replaced or partially replaced by younger people. Because Keanu Reeves is like a vampire and doesn't really age that much.
Gotcha.
And he looks good still. But it appears from the trailers to this new movie that the way they're going to frame it is that Keanu Reeves' character, Neo, who's now Mr. Anderson again, is the director, maybe, of a series of movies called The Matrix, which exists in this Matrix as a movie series. Does that make sense?
Sort of.
It makes about as much sense as it does in the plot,
Okay.
I think.
All right.
Right? So there's the movies. So the idea is that I think this is what it appears to be from the trailers. This has been the theory going around, the fan theory, the fan canon, the fanon, if you will, is that the Matrix Resurrection movies will start with Mr. Anderson having no memory of the Matrix movies, except that they exist in his memories as movies that he made. So the movies are in the movie themselves a movie.
Whoa.
Got it? Very
Okay.
meta.
All right.
Everything has to be meta now.
Mm-hmm.
We can't just have a story. It all has to be self-referential. And I get it. As I've said before to you, and you rightly talked me down off of it, is that we should try and confuse our audience completely all the time. Right?
Right.
And you've always said, maybe not. You in fact said that what we were doing was already challenging to the audience.
Yeah.
And because I'll have ideas like, you know what, for this episode, what if you were like 70 clones all talking to yourself? And you will be like, that would be interesting and perhaps humorous if we had a giant budget. You know, and I had all the time in the world to produce it.
Yeah.
And so then we have to skim it down to where you're a television.
Yeah.
Right? So I understand the appeal of wanting to like throw it back in your audience faces, like, how dare you listen to us? Like, get out of here.
I often feel that way about our audience.
Yeah, like, get out of here.
Yeah.
So I understand the impulse to make everything meta because you want to. It's really because I think it's because we don't have any actual stories anymore, so we have to take our fictional stories and try and put them in real life. This, I think. So anyway, but there's clues in the Matrix Resurrection trailer that this is so. One, he appears to be talking to an agent who seems like a young Mr. Smith, but his agent now, instead of being like an agent of the government of the Matrix, is his movie agent.
Right. Okay.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe a real estate agent. Various other kinds of people we call agents are now serving the role of agent, which I think is maybe more appropriate because in 1999, when the movie came out, I think the big baddie in the world was the government. And I think now the big baddie in the world is giant corporations.
Yeah.
The media.
Which is really the same thing, but
it's the same thing, but it wears a different face. Yeah. There's also behind the movie agent, Mr. Smith, what appears to be a sculpture of Mr. Smith getting punched in the face by Neo in the first movies, which is like a piece of art you could buy from the movies. Mm-hmm. And of course, there's the big tell that in part of the trailer, they're in a theater and the first movies are playing on the theater screen behind them.
No way.
So, it appears that it's probably a movie. And this also has... what would you call it? Not representation. That's what you do for like black gay Indians.
Okay.
What do you call it when you have something that happened before? Precedent.
Right.
Right. Same thing.
Mm-hmm.
In Matrix, quote unquote, canon.
Yeah.
And that there was but it wasn't canon, but maybe it was. See, because there was a cartoon, like in 2002. About, and it's very poorly drawn, but it was just like thrown up on the internet, where it was the cartoon they just went to watch The Matrix, and they were trying to explain it to one of the guys, and the guy was like, it's a dumb idea. And then he walks out of the bar. And then in the next scene, the two people who were just talking to them, they sort of morph into Agent Smiths. And they're like, as long as he doesn't know, the more he thinks it's stupid, the better. Right.
Okay.
And so then people are like, oh, wait, that is canon. Like, that is a movie. Right? And so I think that may be the angle they're going with, which is that the Matrix movies in them are movies themselves in the new Matrix.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, you are also, you see, in the Matrix now because you live in a world in which there were movies.
Oh, I get it now.
Or something,
Yeah.
something to that effect. Very meta.
But they're trying to use this new sort of lever to like bring the audience into the reality of the film.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a new form of brain damage being inflicted upon the populace.
Yeah.
As if they hadn't had enough
Right.
already. But this got me thinking a lot about, I've been speculating this week. Well, one about how our future is currently dictated by the fantasies of teenage boys with acne in high school. And how one day in the future they would be better.
Mm-hmm.
And technology would make them better.
Yeah.
And it didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
And now they're sad.
Yeah.
But also, like, about this idea of canon and what makes something canon or not canon. Like, what makes something official or not official. Or what's in, like, the accepted discourse and what isn't.
Mm-hmm.
And how this is apparently... You see this in a microcosm in fandoms, but it's the same process of like, what's in the Bible? What isn't? What's the point of the Apocrypha? What is it not? Boo-ba-da-boo, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's the same process. And it's also the same process going on with COVID. Because there's all kinds of things happening with COVID still. Like just yesterday, the Pfizer guy was like, you know what? We're going to need a fourth booster. Even so. And people are like, but I thought we were going to have the things, and then we could stop doing the masks and stuff.
Right.
But at the same day, the New York governor imposed a statewide indoor mask mandate.
Yep.
Like in your house, you need $1,000 fine. And so the narrative of COVID is constantly shifting. Like, it's always different.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what is it? How much? And that in itself is like a canon of like, what is the accepted narrative of COVID? And then you got people like me spinning Apocrypha or a competing canon. And then how do people decide? And is that the whole question of modernity? Is that the entire thing?
Well,
this question of like,
I mean, there is sort of a Western civilization has lost its sort of cohesive narrative, and so we can't hold together on really anything as far as what we believe about events because we have no reason for existing anymore. You know,
we have no reason for existing. True. I mean, yeah.
I mean, we like the West, Western culture.
I think,
yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think it's also true of a lot of our listeners in their personal lives. Like, what are you even doing? You know?
I know there's some people out there doing some interesting stuff right now.
Yeah, but a lot of our listeners aren't.
Yeah.
You know? And I was talking with Suplex about this because I this is out of love. This comes from a place of love, of me hating them.
Mm-hmm.
Because I feel like you have to, this is why I sort of wanted to, because I was, I sent you the message for season 2. I said, what if season 2 was absolutely nothing in any way like season 1?
Yeah, I remember that. Mm-hmm.
And you sent me a little cartoon of a guy going, what if things were different? And then he, like, messes up his house and he looks around and goes, oh no.
Yeah.
And that was your implication of, like, we would be breaking the show. But I sort of felt like we should break this show.
Yeah.
Because then I feel like if you allow people to get connected to the show and then you care about them, you will be unwilling to tell them the things they need to hear because it might hurt them.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to destroy your relationship with them to tell them the truth.
Okay. Yeah.
You see?
I see where you're coming from.
It's like why you shouldn't take advertisers. Because if you take an advertiser, then like let's say we were sponsored by Chick-fil-A.
Yep.
Right, and every episode I come on and said, "Go get your frosted lemonade.
Mm-hmm.
Woo! Use offer code faking gay. You get 10% off your frosted lemonade or whatever."
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But then the next week it came out that Chick-fil-A was funding a slavery operation in Cambodia where they produced chickens on the cheap using child labor.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then there would be a temptation of me to not call out Chick-fil-A for that because we were getting a bunch of money from them.
Right.
See?
Yeah.
And I feel that's also true for just having people like you, which is why I've always striven to destroy relationships before they go too far. Because then you can't tell people the truth.
You don't want all those relationships holding you back.
Well, but so this is why I felt the need to attack our listeners and still do and insult them.
Yeah.
Because that has to be fresh. And also because they deserve it.
Sure. Yeah.
Right.
Clearly.
So in their personal lives, like, what are you even doing? But also like they have no reason to exist. But maybe we have no reason to exist because we have no story that can be agreed upon. And we cannot because we have no authority because there is no because authority comes from author and there is no one author anymore. Mm-hmm. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
Like in Homeric, like in Greek culture, everything was about the Homeric myths, right? And there may have been more than one Homer, but still there was like a canon of the stories, right? And they fit together, and it's like, and here's all the stories that are the real ones. But now, with the internet especially, everyone is Homer. Saying, here's my dumb idea about this thing. And you send it out into the world, and everyone is authoring their own version of the story about what's happening, and therefore there can be no consensus. I don't know if that's good or bad. Like, there doesn't need to be consensus when the official quote-unquote story is stupid. But it is a problem for, like, how you avoid complete societal breakdown.
Yeah. Well, I think we've kind of talked about hierarchy before, and I think part of what's happening is there was a hierarchy in the West that didn't serve the interests of the people that now are running the show. So they said, well, we're going to blow up the hierarchy. And they used several tools like, let's say the LSD experiment, let's say the internet, let's say normalization of sodomy. I mean, you could go down this long list of ways that the moral hierarchy of the West was destroyed. But I think the eventual goal is to rebuild it upside down on a new narrative and with different people with different values at the top.
Yes, it is. And this is why, like Erdogan, the guy from Turkey, who looks like a turtle.
Yeah, yeah.
Like his face looks like a turtle.
Yeah.
He recently said social media is turned into one of the main threats for, quote, a developed democracy like us. First of all, that's silly, describing Turkey in those terms.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's named after a Thanksgiving bird. But also, he then said disinformation has become a global security issue. And this is what they're talking about with disinformation. It's like a question of, it's really the same fight that has been a problem ever since we made the mistake of writing words down, of who gets to control what is the official words that go in the book.
Yeah.
It's the same question forever. It's why there's different branches of Christianity and to some extent Islam and Judaism and all these things. It's like, because if you have a different canon, you have a different religion. And so the question is, why do we deal with the canon problem? And also, does it matter? Like, why does it matter? Why do people care? Why do they get upset when Doctor Who decides that the Daleks came from a different place than they said 20 years ago? and they get really upset that the canon has been invalidated.
Yeah.
Like, extremely emotional. I had this issue with the Halo series of video games. Do you remember those?
Yeah.
Did you ever play them at all?
Not really, but
I played them a lot in college, and in the game there was it was obvious that, like, so there was like three main factions: the humans and then the Covenant aliens they were fighting, and then they would always talk about the Covenant aliens worship some other extinct species of aliens called the Forerunner, and they got all their technology from like their old structures and artifacts that they were now gone. And they tried to be like them, and they hoped they would one day follow them on the path of transcendence.
Mm-hmm.
And it was clear from the first three games, it was hinted at very explicitly that the humans were the Forerunner the aliens worship. They just didn't know it.
Oh.
Neither did the humans.
Okay.
Like, the humans used to have an advanced galactical civilization,
Mm-hmm.
but a big problem occurred, and they were reduced down to one planet on Earth in a primitive state. And then they built back up. Right. And so then the prophets of the religion know this, but they know that if the aliens see that the humans are the things they worship, their religion will fall apart. So they have to kill the humans to get rid of them and continue to pretend like they were this ancient, transcendent species that went into cyber heaven.
Interesting.
Very clear plot.
Yeah.
It was obvious.
Okay.
And then the company that made it, Bungie, sold the franchise to another company called 343, and they came out with Halo 4, where they said, all of that is stupid. The Forerunner is this weird bald thing that lives in a floating sphere inside of another floating sphere.
Okay.
Right? And then everyone was like, okay. But see, and then that sort of just, I personally just like threw up my hands like, well, then what is the point? Right? If you throw away but here's the thing, it's hard to, because on one level, your answer to that might be, this is some people's answer to these problems, is to say that doesn't count. That's not really canon.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's a different author. Their thing is, but on the other hand, it's hard to do that because it comes wrapped in official packaging and it has the official trademark. And then it's like, even to yourself that wants to be like, has valid reasons for ignoring the authorship of it. Like, well, it isn't the author, it's a different person, different group. Has trouble distinguishing that in your mind, and then it creates a dissonance, and then you just you either go with the new canon or you stop caring.
Right, and that's
like
it's painful. It's hard to do
off.
Because once you're invested in that story, if somebody comes along and just rewrites it, everything that you were tied to is now changed. It's like you were married to somebody and you wake up one day and you realize they're not the person you thought they were, or something.
Yeah. Exactly.
It's a feeling of betrayal.
Right. And it's a what the whole question is, and I think what the question we're all dealing with is a question of continuity. Like, betrayal is like the destruction of continuity between the past and the now.
Mm-hmm.
And see, this is the same because like what I experienced trying to ignore the Halo changes when they went from Bungie to 343 and being unable to really fully do so, even though the question of authorship is valid in that case, is the same problem that people are running into now in religious circles, like in Catholicism, with like who the Pope is and like seed vacantism.
Yeah.
Because if you actually go by the book, like the people that for people that don't know, who aren't invested in niche weird Catholicist arguments, as I have been, because they're fascinating. For a long time, since Vatican II, which was in the 60s, there's been a debate. There's been a section of Catholics, maybe they're not even Catholic, some people would argue they're not, who say currently there is no Pope.
Mm-hmm.
There's seed vacantis, which is Latin for like empty. The seat is vacant. The empty seaters, like the seat of Peter, is empty.
Okay.
Currently, there is no Pope because the position itself has been invalidated by crossing various lines that previous popes themselves said they could never cross.
Mm-hmm.
And if you actually look at the documents they cite, they have a very persuasive argument in some cases. Like, well, yeah, this Pope did say that if anyone after him should ever go against this particular saying, they would invalidate their position or whatever. And then you'd be like, okay, well, following that, it would make sense then. This does appear to be like one of them, for instance, was that you would be that any Catholic. There was this, I don't remember I'm not this nerdy into it where I know all the names of the encyclicals and stuff, like some people are. But there was this one that said if any Catholic, and it wasn't that long ago, I think it was in the late 1800s, if any Catholic worships or prays to another god or by another creed, it's very, the way it's worded makes it sort of like the instance I'm going to talk about is very like damning. Then they will be de facto excommunicated.
Yeah.
Okay. And then people are like, well, but here's John Paul praying with Muslims and like kissing a Quran and saying we worship the same God.
Yeah.
And then they're like, well, then the Pope is by definition excommunicated. And then his successor cannot receive it. Like, it doesn't make any sense, right? So how do you deal with those issues? But see, the problem that they run into is that even though by the letters in the books, it appears that the authorship has been broken, what another famous seed vacantist said, he said, well, actually, he was a seed vacantist for a while, and then he came, I forget his name, he was this weird German guy. But then he came around and retracted that, and he said, well, what makes the Pope is if the world acknowledges someone as Pope. That's what makes the Pope. Like, you're the Pope if people generally agree that you are. And that's why people have trouble, the seed vacantists even have trouble, like, the position sort of breaks down because actually what we're talking about, there's like authorship, there's also like it's just the perception of the populace which determines what it is. Like, I like, just like the trademark of the Halo thing sort of gives it authority even if they're not the people that made the thing. Or in Star Wars, right? Star Wars originally made by Lucas and Lucasfilms. They had this giant expanded universe of novels and stuff of like how the Force worked, and Chewbacca gets killed by a moon that lands on him, which is a great death for Chewbacca.
Yeah.
He's fighting and like a moon collapses on the planet and destroys him. And all this other stuff. And then Disney buys it and they're like, girl boss, same thing as the first movie.
Yeah.
And they just tossed literally decades of this builded universe into the garbage overnight. And really made a worse product.
Yeah.
It was more appealing to a mass audience because it was flashy and which is what they wanted to do. They wanted to make money, right? Fair. But the depth of the characters and the universe that had been built was now just trashed on and made extremely shallow.
As it must be, because it was made by people that don't believe anything.
Right, as it must be. But here's the thing. Can you just ignore it and say, but the expanded universe is the actual thing, when Disney has the trademark and the promotional posters and the lightsabers and all this? Like, that perception of them as the authority. I mean, that...
Like, I think human beings have a right to say, no, what's been done here is simply an act of destruction of something good, and therefore it is of no value. You know,
I agree. Yeah, I agree they have that right, but I think even if you acknowledge you have that right, you have a difficulty psychologically doing that in the face of someone that is like, but I have the trademark.
Right. Well, then it's,
you know,
then it's what people are going to choose differently on this point. And some people are going to say, no, this was the destruction of something good, because there are people that make their way in the world, they make their mark on history by just destroying things that are good.
Yeah.
You know?
Yes.
There are a lot of people that do that, and they've done their work in our lifetime. And so we, as individuals, then respond to their works in real time. And we either say, no, I reject their work because they are agents of destruction. Or someone will say, no, I accept their work because progress, because it's,
Right.
it's, do you believe in the linear progress, upward progress of humanity as defined by secular humanism, etc.? And if you believe in that, then your inclination is going to be to accept the works of destruction as progress. And if you don't believe in that linear progression, humanistic linear progression of humanity, you're going to stop and say, no, they've destroyed something good and true and beautiful. Their work is nothing but destruction, and I reject it on those grounds. And that's dividing that difference in perspective is what's dividing people a lot, and I think is core to the crisis of Western society.
Yeah, like the debate. Yes, like the debate is currently like, it's like, what is the canon of America? Like, what counts as like
Right.
our history?
Yeah.
Right. Like, is it Pilgrims and Virginia and like cowboys in the frontier, or is it black slavery and Juneteenth? And it's like this art in World War II and Nazism.
Yeah.
Right. Is it? And it's really it's a fight about what is canon. And then I think this is like sort of gets to the heart of every, and you see it in these little stupid fandoms all the time.
Yeah.
They just pop up. It's like the same, but if you could figure out how to solve that problem of like what counts as canon in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, you would basically be able to figure out how to save Western civilization, or at least stabilize it.
Well, another component to that is the question of whether the canon is open or closed. And I think at times, both in stories like Star Wars or whatever, and then in civilizations, if the canon is closed, and this is what I think part of what the Protestant Reformation recognized as an issue was that the canon was supposed to be closed, but it's functionally not closed, and we're just throwing more stuff into it, and we're having coherence problems. And so the Protestants said, no, the canon is closed, and we are standing on that position that the canon is closed, and therefore we are departing with we are departing from the later additions to the canon as proposed by the Roman Church. And I think that was the core of it. And then you can see that in America too. The canon was cracked open when we threw out the Articles of Confederation and adopted the Constitution, which is a crazy story in its own right, as far as like the subterfuge and the skullduggery that was going on with that. And then but then so there was peace, and then there was some chaos because they opened the canon, and then it was closed again for a while. And then they opened it again with the American Civil War, and there was lots of chaos and destruction, and really the entire psychological, the whole telos of America was destroyed and rebuilt in that process with the canon opening, and then it was closed again all the way to World War I, and then it was opened again World War I, World War II, and then it was closed again for a little while, and then in the 60s they opened it again with the sexual revolution, and then that pattern of destruction has gone on, and now they're trying to adopt all the changes and close the canon. So all the people that were dissidents, that were fighting against the machine, the hippie generation, all those people now are the ones that are fighting with their with everything they can for the dominant narrative. They're fighting for girl bosses and equality of outcomes and all this liberal, not liberal, all this degenerate stuff that our country is trying to wrap itself around as its new narrative. And so they're fighting for that as the new orthodoxy, and they're attempting to close the canon again so that they can have their age of peace based on those beliefs that they've attempted to write into the canon. And then that's the struggle of our time, I think.
Yeah, you're right. And this is why it's always a contest to connect present ideology to the past. Like, well, George Washington enforced vaccine mandates.
Mm-hmm.
That's what what we believe is basically what the founders said.
Yeah, you always invoke
you
them.
pull quotes,
right? Because you're trying to legitimize the changes to the canon.
Yeah, and the canon is continuity. You have to frame that your thing is the continuous thing with the original.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what everyone's trying to do. And this is why we have so much, like, this is why QAnon took off and still goes, and why I love it. Because it's fantastically crazy.
Yeah.
Have you heard of the latest thing where they all gathered in Dallas to await the return of John F. Kennedy Jr.?
Yeah, and it really hurt my feelings just to know that happened. Like, I felt really bad for them.
This is how great, like I was saying, how great would it have been if he'd have showed up?
Oh, I mean, it would have been great.
But that is so, but see and people are like, well, how did that happen? How does people get, like, how does this? It's because I think the America they had in their head canon of what America was, has been shown to diverge so drastically from what is really going on, or what people is trying to claim that canon is in popular culture.
Right.
That it's impossible to reconcile.
Yeah.
And so they and like it goes down to like who they are and who they think they are, and like it becomes an identity crisis. This is why so like the narrative issue and the issue of like who controls, this is why I always talk about the narrative, has to go hand in hand with identity politics, because it's like it gets to like, who are you? Who are Americans? What does it mean to be an American? What does it mean? This is all, and it goes, but it's the continuity, it's the continuity of the storyline. And when it doesn't match, and people have no way to match it, reconciled in their heads, they begin to go insane. I think that's what insanity is. It's a mismatch between your continuity and your sense of self.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like basically how schizophrenia happens. You know? And this is why we have a worldview repair service show. But it's also difficult to, like, did you know the CIA at one point in the 50s, they started something explicitly called, this comes from one of the Operation Paperclip guys, Weltanschauungskrieg, which means worldview warfare.
Yeah, I believe that.
Worldview warfare.
Mm-hmm.
That's, I mean, imagine, just think about that. Worldview war, like that's what it is. It's arguing about, and I guess it's the same fight that's been going on since the dawn of time, is like who has because you know, the Protestants have one canon, the Catholics have another canon, and they're very similar. You know, they have most of the same books, but the Catholics have a few more.
I think the main fight among that is not, I mean, there are differences, but I think the main point of contention is one side contests that the canon is closed and the other one that it's open. I think I've always thought that was the principal argument, but in the Reformation.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Okay, so the advantage of closing the canon and saying no more is that you don't get any new additions that can disrupt the current sense of self-identity of whatever you're talking about.
Right.
America, the church. But the disadvantage would be that as time goes on and you get further and further away from the events that set the canon down, the ability to connect the canon to modern people's lives grows thin. I've always thought this was maybe the purpose of Apocrypha.
Mm-hmm.
Like trying to write, like.
Well, the cult, you have to have a living culture.
Yeah, there has to be a living part of it too.
Right. And so I think, yeah, you have to draw a line between what's the closed canon and what's the living culture. And if your culture is also closed, like your canon is, then the problem that you state arises where people are not attached to it anymore after a time. So yeah, it's like the culture still has to be open and alive, but it has to have roots in a closed canon, in my judgment.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think when I say this is the purpose of Apocrypha, I meant more like like all the little legends and myths that spring up about Europe, like how Jesus traveled here when he was 7, and how St. Thomas really came over to our city and planted this tree that this monastery is under.
Right.
Right. I feel like that's the purpose of those sort of stories, is trying to connect you to the underlying canon. And I think the inability to do that in, like, say, America is largely what made Mormonism.
Yeah.
Because you couldn't reasonably say that Jesus came to the New World unless you invented a whole nother miraculous thing where he did.
Right.
And then that allowed Americans, or at least a portion of Americans, to feel like they had continuity with this thing that they cherished, the Bible, and their faith and stuff. And that's why Mormonism thrived. Could only have really been born in the New World. Right? Because, and that's why it was so accepted, because you always wonder, like, well, why are these things accepted? It's because people are like, well, that all happened a really long time ago, far away. We don't have any traditions of, like, Saint Sebastian sailed over here and made a monastery.
Right.
And therefore, because Saint Sebastian knew Saint Cyrilliac or something, and Saint Cyrilliac touched the cross that Jesus was on, there's no physical connection between us and them.
Right.
Right. And that's what all these things, it's the same thing as relics. Like this idea that, like, Catholic churches and Orthodox churches, the altar has to include a piece of a relic of a saint, either their physical body or something they owned or touched, right, in it, which this is a practice they still largely do. Though usually, mostly it's what they call secondhand relics, which is like something they owned or touched instead of like a piece of their bones, which is what they used to use. Like there's a lot of old churches in Europe where, like, the altar has embedded in it like the severed hand of a saint or something. Sort of metal.
Yeah.
But that was, but they felt like you needed a physical connect, like you needed something which gave continuity to where you are, to go back to Jesus, to go back to Abraham, to go back to Adam. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. And there's something to that. Like, it's about continuity. Canon is continuity, and you have to have it where you are now. And so this is why, as there's more immigration coming into America, the people then look around and say, well, but how do I fit into the story? I can't say that my Jamaican Saint Arimathea came over here and planted a cherry tree and chopped it down with George Lincoln, Washington. I wasn't on the.
Well, it's interesting because the canon is open right now, and they've made a bunch of changes wherein all the immigrants to America are the heroes. The recent immigrants to America are the heroes, and the founding stock are the villains. And then they're trying to close the canon again. And I don't know how you do that when the founding stock still represents the majority of the country.
Yes.
But that's what they're trying to do. It's a mess. Part of it is they've destroyed too much. It like when the Articles of Confederation was thrown out and the Constitution was instituted, you can't they didn't change so much that it would be impossible for people to live with the new canon. Right? But I think the changes that they've tried to make now, they destroyed way too much, and many, many people in this country cannot live with the new canon that they're trying to close right now, which is the struggle of our time.
Because they can't fit into it.
Right. There's no place for us in it. And so, there's going to have to be a war before the canon is closed again.
Yeah, sadly. I think like this is the push, and I think this process is what made quote unquote white America also, which is now the problem with the new canon, right? Because when there was previous immigration largely from Europe, there was a bunch of discrete separate communities like the Germans and the Italians and the Irish who were separate from the Anglos. And then what we did, this is why, listener, they made the Pledge of Allegiance say one nation under God. It was like, we're all one nation now.
Right.
And you should forget about your roots, and we'll all pretend that we came over on the Mayflower.
Right.
Well, I'll just, even though that's not true for most of us, like it's not true for me. I know a lot of my, like by some definitions, I'm a generation immigrant, right? My mother was born in another place.
Okay.
Right. So some people describe first generation as like a parent that was, so I know that's not true with me. And on my father's side, most of my ancestry came over here after 1776 too. I'm not a child of the revolution.
Yeah,
right?
neither am I. Yeah.
Right, but they were all like, but we can all pretend that we're 1776ers. And
well, one of the things that happened in like the interwar years is that the canon was opened and incorporated those people in, and it was kind of closed on the idea of Christendom 2.0. Where all from all over the Christian Europe, people came together into this new land that was a land of Christians of all sorts, and organized vaguely around Christian, ethics and philosophy,
Jesus and freedom.
Which, I mean, there's a lot of problems with that view, but I mean that was the idea anyway, and they were able to get the canon closed again, and so you had like the 50s.
Right. And so so now you have a bunch of people coming over who also want to be included in the story of America because they need continuity in their lives.
Yeah.
But they, just because of how they look, can't pretend they were pilgrims or on the Mayflower or whatever, or with the Christopher Columbuses. Right. And so then there's this contorted effort to try and write everyone in a positive way, that it's what they're doing. It's the same problem of like trying to say that Joseph of Arimathea came to Britain and planted trees.
Well, I guess there isn't a philosophical like nobody really believes in democracy anymore.
No,
it's collapsed, and so you can't bring everybody around that to close the canon. You can't. Most of the people, I mean, so Catholics from Central and South America are having an easier time integrating than immigrants from India, for example, are. Because they can there's still a place for them in the historical canon of Christendom, broadly Christendom 2.0 or whatever. But a lot of people coming in now don't have no place in that. They don't believe in democracy, and then there's this momentary cultural movement of victim worship. And so, okay, well, America's going to be the land of the victims, right? And then you need a villain for that. And so the I guess the symbolic leadership of the last canonic era of America have been transformed into the villains of the new one in order to create a new victim-based canon where the victims are worshipped, and so you have to have villains there. Because I think the previous edition of of American canon didn't necessarily need an internal villain to hold together, but this new one does, because it doesn't have any sort of really compelling philosophical or ethical or religious claims to it. It's sort of vapid. And so so then you have to have a victim. It's like, COVID or 9/11 are supposed to bring everybody together to comply to comply.
And they done it all.
They're gonna hold the state together with terrorizing everybody because there's nothing else that can do it. They've thrown out every compelling teleological position that could give people a positive reason for living together and cooperating. So now the only things left are terror and doom and hysteria and mass. We're held together by mass psychosis, whether it's like fear of COVID or fear of like racial boogeymen or whatever. That's all they've got.
Terrorism,
that's all they've got left, because we've thrown out everything that held us together in the form of a broadly Christian society. And so now that's their last play.
Yeah, and so I was wondering. Why was it so hard for me to like just say, okay, like with the Halo thing, to be like, okay, well the new one doesn't count,
right?
Or just throw it out. And it's the same thing of why it was so hard for Protestants to separate from the church. It's the same thing of why it's so hard for Americans. Now, it's because if doing so breaks continuity, and people are willing to go to war rather than break personal continuity with the past, because then it makes their life meaningless.
Yeah.
Like that's what it's about. Like life is understood through stories, and if you break someone's story down, they're like, well, then all my life was wasted.
Yeah. Well, yeah. If the canon, and if the canon is becoming incoherent, like if it's not working anymore, right? Like if you have to have an entire profession of canon lawyers to figure out how your canon works. I mean, I'm sorry, that's like kind of an unfair dig at the Catholics, but maybe you see my point. And we're having to do that at a societal level too. Is like there's this whole class of people to try to figure out how the American canon works and to try to keep it functional. It's like the legal profession in general. I had an argument with a lawyer recently about we were talking about the Rittenhouse case, and I just pointed out to him, I said, the arguments you're making have no basis in any sort of ethical system. They're just you're playing lawyer word games, and nothing you say means anything ethically. It has zero connection. Like if you were to take somebody from medieval Europe and plop them down and explain the situation and give them your argument, they wouldn't even connect with it at all because it has no transcendent value. It's just little gotcha games over stupid words in the law that don't mean anything. And so when your civilization is facing that sort of a crisis, there's no easy way to like just keep putting your finger in the dike. That you can't hold that together. So now we're in a crisis point, and they're trying to rebuild it. They're trying to rebuild it in something stable, but they don't have the tools to do so because all the tools have been thrown out. So what do we got? We've got COVID, we've got terrorism, we've got racism, and those are the things we're going to try to hold our society together with. But it's not going to work.
Yeah, like this is why I brought up the BS Zelda no Dissento in the intro.
Yeah,
was that I'm curious of when people are able to just throw it away, like without any issue, because in 1995, Nintendo did this weird thing where they had something called the BSX, which was only released in Japan.
Okay,
and it was a satellite-based Nintendo system.
I've never heard
of
this.
Not internet, satellite-based.
This is wild.
And it was strange because here was the idea. You could play video games like you play TV shows. Like they would come on at a specific time when they were broadcast, and when they weren't being broadcast, you couldn't tune in and play them.
Weird.
Yes. So like the Zelda games, BS Zelda Dissento, would be broadcast from a satellite like every Thursday night and then all day Saturday, and you could tune in and play, and like it would remember your file, but when it wasn't being broadcast, you couldn't play it. And it had some other things as well, but this was only in Japan that this happened, and it had some other things as well that made it unique, like the main character was not Link. Okay. It was all the same as like, it was sort of like roughly it was the layout and the gameplay of A Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past. But it was this other character just called the Youth. He had different looks. There was different, like he wasn't saving Zelda, he saved stuff. And so it was this, but it was in the same universe, quote unquote. And yet, okay, so that happened. There were like 3 games in that release. But that is widely just ignored and considered non-canonical when people try to do their Zelda fandom. They're like, well, that doesn't count. Right. Because there's, and it has a couple things. One, it doesn't feature the same protagonist, and two, it like wasn't available to most people, so they couldn't think about it anyway. So, but now that they know about it, So that's an example of like official story, official gameplay, official narrative that the populace just goes, yeah, but no.
Well, in the civic sense, that's what the Amish did.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point.
And I think that's a good. The Amish people were just not having the changes of, I don't know which episode. I don't know that much about the Amish, but they at some point decided we're gonna have this whole other story. Our objectives are going to be different. Our entire lifestyle is going to be different. Like Nintendo delivered by satellite in one particular location. It's not going to work for everybody. It's really only going to work in like agriculturally blessed areas where they can get away with living that way. Like Amish living in the desert wouldn't work.
No, you'd have to live like a Plains Indian, which maybe we should.
Yeah, well, that would be a whole different
maybe all of our
thing.
map people should just gather in the plains, and we should hunt buffalo.
Sweet.
And that would be like how we do that. But so there's all these problems about canon and like what makes this is also why I said how to learn to stop wearing it and embrace Black Santa, because I realize what they're trying to do is they're like, people are like, I need to be also to have continuity with America. I need to also be in these stories.
Yeah.
And that's what's driving it, even though the way it's taking shape is weird and deformed. That energy is okay. We just need to channel it in a better way.
Yeah.
I guess.
Well, it's like, that let's go back to the distinction between canon
like
and
inclusion without destruction is what we need to be, or something like that.
Well, the distinction between a closed canon and a living open culture is that
may be the key.
Is that you can have Black Santa Claus. That's great. Go do Black Santa Claus.
Even though maybe you shouldn't, because the image of a black guy coming in at night with a sack.
See, it's culturally dependent.
And going, ho, ho, ho.
It depends.
Where's my ho? I mean, I don't know. Just let him have it. I think that one may backfire.
You're killing the whole thing. No,
I'm just saying.
But that's why you can have Black Santa, and that's fine because that's the living culture. Santa Claus, while important to our culture, is not part of it's not canon, right? Or at least I would argue that it's not canon. That's part of the difficulty is deciding which things are in your canon, which things are in your culture, and so that's a lot of things people fight about. But yeah, it's like, okay, have Black Santa. That's great. If that's
Black Santa, or also like Black Jesus or Middle Eastern Jesus, that's really only a problem in a technological society that has visual representations everywhere. Like in the past, people have told stories of Jesus wherever they were.
Yeah.
And they just imagine him as the people around the campfire.
Well, so I have a problem with that because
of it everywhere, people are like, well, that's not me.
At some point, if you just make Jesus whatever color you want, at some point you're destroying the idea of the historicity of Scripture, and so then Jesus just becomes Santa Claus.
He was obviously a Celtic yogi with red hair.
So shut up. And so then that's why Jesus has to be a Jew, whatever they looked like at the time, right? Mm-hmm. And it's not so much that I'm claiming that Jesus was like this white, blue-eyed, blonde-haired guy or whatever. Like that's also not an accurate claim. What I'm saying is that like Jesus was one guy that looked one certain way. And we need to. That's not subject to our whims. That's not subject to our cultural needs. Like he's a real human being and God at the same time, and he had real distinct characteristics during his life on the earth. And because those are objective, because Scripture is historically meaningful, and if you take that away by making Jesus Chinese, you rip up part of the canon, and so that's the canon culture divide happening real time, and we have to take. That's the thing is you got to take both things serious and valuable. Groups of people that just think that everything that's not canon it is not important. So they take the things that they like about their culture and try to make them into canon. Because they love canon and they don't appreciate culture. That gives you problems. Or if you don't care about canon and culture is everything, then what is your canon and your culture get confused and everything's flexible and you have continuity crises.
Yes.
So it's like you have to hold both things for what they are and understand their value and how to maintain and treat them. And that's a difficult thing for a civilization to negotiate, I will grant.
And I was talking about this with someone else, and he brought up the question. He said, does canon matter? And I made a somewhat similar argument to what you said. And then he said, he gave me an example from Jesus himself, which I never thought about. So do you remember when the Sadducees were questioning Jesus about like, so look, there's this guy and he had a wife and he died and his brother married her and then he died and his brother married her and they had 7 brothers and all did this. At the resurrection, whose wife is she going to be? Right. That story. Mm-hmm. Because the Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection. They didn't, right? And the other sects of Jews did. Mm-hmm. What I never realized is why they didn't. And it was the same issue. It was an issue of canon. Okay. The Sadducees, apparently, only held that the Torah, the 5 Mosaic books, were canon. Mm-hmm. And everything else was apocrypha. The prophets, the Chronicles, the Kings, the Psalms. That was like, it was maybe okay, but it wasn't like divinely inspired. Okay. That was their position. Right? And Jesus, this is why Jesus apparently answers them with this answer that he gives them. He says, are you not greatly confused because you know neither the power of God nor the scriptures? Like you don't know what's canon. But he does not take this very clear opportunity to do something that may have been, we would think would be helpful, which was to lay out and say, here's the canon. Mm-hmm. Like if you were thinking like what a religious figure might do, one of the things you might expect that would be helpful is to lay out exactly what are the religious books, but he doesn't do that. Or to say, like, here's the exact way you should worship me, which he also doesn't do. Or here's the exact way you should do church, which he doesn't do. Right? He specifically avoids giving us a canon. And then my friend pointed out this point. He said, but what he then says is he proves the point using their own canon. Because he says, from the Torah, he says, he says, I am the God of Jacob and of Isaac and of Abraham. So he's not the God of the living, but the dead, which is in the Torah. Mm-hmm. Therefore implying that by their own scriptures, by their own definition of canon, his position was still correct. Mm-hmm. So he avoided the issue entirely of what is and wasn't canon and just said, based on your own ideas, this is still true. Yeah. The truth is still there. And so that's why I talked about in the intro, I said a monk asked Keegan, how does an enlightened one return to the ordinary world? And he replied, a broken mirror never reflects light again. Fallen flowers never go back to the old branches. That's a koan. In Buddhism, these are these little riddles that if you understand them are supposed to give you enlightenment. They've never given me enlightenment, but that's probably a testament on me rather than them. But I like that because there was a saying. Alan Watts told this story. He was talking with a Zen monk, and they were talking about translating Zen books into English from Japanese. And the Zen master said, waste of time. And he's like, why is that? He said, if you really understand Zen, you can use any book. You can use the Bible. You can use the dictionary. And I thought it struck me that is sort of what Jesus was doing. Like, if you really understood what mattered, any book would count. Any canon, you could derive it. It's like this saying in the Bible, like, what can be known about God has been made plain to them in the things that have been made. Like it's like if your heart was in the right place, it's obvious. And like any canon would work. And so in some sense, I think that canon doesn't matter. In another sense, I think because we're flawed, it does, and we have to fight about it. But I think Jesus' point and why he didn't set down a canon, it specifically is like, it's beyond that. You know, it's, if I gave you the set, that would be a hindrance for you in some ways because you'd think the answer was found there. Really, the answer is found the kingdom of God is within you, right? And I think that was an interesting spin my friend put on it. Like, does it even matter? And I thought that was a good argument he made for why maybe it doesn't.
Well, I think we have to synthesize two things here. I mean, one, it's like yes, the kingdom of God is within you, but at the same time, Jesus gave the apostles the job of finishing and closing the canon in the apostolic era, and which I think that they did.
But what about Enoch, which they all quote from, and then we don't consider canon?
Well,
except unless you're Ethiopian Orthodox, which they threw everything in the kitchen sink in their Bible,
right?
Which is somewhat fun.
You can quote. Who's to say they can't? Who's to say it's canon if they quote it?
Well, I mean, that part would be because it'd be in the canon.
I mean, I think. Well, it's parts of it are it's referentially canon, but I think at some point you have to. Not every history book is canon,
right? That's true.
But that doesn't mean that history doesn't matter, or that the canon doesn't.
Or you can just make it up however you want.
History. So it's right. So I don't just because I don't think the Book of Enoch is canon doesn't mean I don't think it's historical or valuable. Mm-hmm. But I think that there are reasons, probably more to do with doctrinal positions about who God is rather than what history things happened, that it was not included in the canon. Mm. But I want to go back to
the sound of the rain needs no translation.
But I would like to go back to your example of Jesus handling the Sadducees, and he often handled lawyers this way, which I'm using a pejorative lawyers against them.
Yes, which is fair. All lawyers deserve to be hated.
Well, he wouldn't play their word games, and he wouldn't answer their questions, and he wouldn't deal with somebody asking him a dishonest, tricky trap question like lawyers are wont to do, especially in the courtroom, or often different authority figures when interrogating citizens play silly games and tell you that the ignorance of the law is no excuse. But Jesus had no interest in playing gotcha games with people that were asking dishonest trick questions of him.
Yeah, it's like your lawyer friend arguing about the Rittenhouse case.
Yeah, and Jesus would leave them confused by answering their tricks with things like riddles that still, as you pointed out, contained truth if they had eyes to see it. But then when he was with his disciples, he would speak to them plainly of the things of God. And because they were asking honest questions of him, and they really wanted to know, and they acknowledged his authority to tell them, and so he dealt with them very differently. And I think that's instructive when you've got people trying to rewrite your canon and dazzle you with lawyer baloney and come and fiddle all the rules around and be all postmodern and subjective about what words mean and what we should believe. You don't have to treat them as if they're asking you an honest question or they're being intellectually honest. I think that's a valid defense against the new postmodern nonsense that's trying to become the new canon, is that you don't have to answer their fake gotcha questions with sincerity. You can throw it right back in their face, which I think is called being shrewd as a serpent and innocent as a dove. And I think that's part of how we deal with the age that we find ourselves in.
The world is vast and wide. Why do you put on your robes at the sound of a bell?
Is that another Cohen?
Right, yes. And you're supposed to read. This was what I was thinking. Like, well, if canon doesn't, is this like a way of that? Like, they're just like any if you could use the dictionary. But anyway, I think you're correct.
Well, I think that's the problem with the Eastern stuff is that it doesn't really have a canon.
It doesn't. Well, that is that's their way. Like Western Abrahamic religions have a beginning and an end, and so that's how you have sort of a story, and you try to find yourself within the story. And Eastern religions have a beginning and an end that are the same. They wrap back around. It's like a cycle, and so they both have to have a closed piece for it to be to have any meaning in it.
Right.
But what is the way? The master said, an open-eyed man falling into a well. So there you go. I mean, listen. That's why I also wanted to talk about dogs that know when their owners are coming home.
I think we've talked about that before.
I know, we haven't discussed the book itself.
It's been a long time.
We haven't discussed the book itself.
Okay, good.
I wanted to drill into that. We discussed the thinking of it.
Mm-hmm. That was in the Rupert Sheldrake episode, I believe.
Yeah, we discussed the thinking of it. This is a book by Rupert Sheldrake. When we talked about his overall work, but we never actually got into the specifics of his book.
Okay, great.
So I wanted to discuss it because this also breaks canon, because the canon of science and like the acceptable forms of thought. Because when the CIA was doing their worldview warcraft, which they explicitly said they were doing, one of the things they would do is they would hire people like celebrities and stuff, and to frame things as crazy. Mm-hmm. And they did this at first with the UFO phenomenon. Like they would do things like soon, like after they did their thing, it would become like, you would redefine the problem instead of like, did this happen or not in political terms, and then make it so that if someone brought it up, they seem like a crazy person.
Yeah.
Which is the whole point of debunking.
Well, they created the whole idea of a conspiracy theorist. I mean, that was a...
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
They made up the idea of a conspiracy theorist to debunk, and that was the way of shutting down people that were trying to do an apocrypha to the official U.S. canon, whatever it was, the official narrative. And that has broken down recently in a lot of places. But the scientific canon that we hold, like the acceptable beliefs for an American, is like telepathy and stuff is not true. But Rupert Sheldrake did some very convincing experiments in a very scientific way with animals, dogs, that showed that it was true, or at least seems to be. So basically what happened was he knew someone that had a dog that appeared to know whenever the owner was coming home. So they'd be sitting around in the house, and then when the owner would be coming back home, the dog would get excited, go wait by the door or the window, and seem to always know when the person was coming home. And the objections being raised were always like, well, the dog has a sense of time and sort of gets the idea when it's like 5:30 and they're coming home. But they found this was true even when the person stayed late at work and didn't come home at the right time. The dog did not go to the door. Or when they came home early, the dog would like get up at 12 and be like, oh, they're coming home. And they'd still stand by the door. And so he started thinking, well, is this real, or is this something we're just convincing ourselves is happening? Mm-hmm. Like, is this just selection bias? Is this? So what he did is he did 15 years of research on this, including surveying people, collecting data about their reports, and doing laboratory tests in the field, where he would do things like set up video cameras in someone's house, watch their animal, and have it time synced to the person's movements, and see if the animal really did go to the door or the window to anticipate their owner's arrival when the owner was set to come home at randomized intervals from throwing dice. And he found that the dog was, I believe, 12 times more likely to be found sitting at the door or the window when the owner was within 10 to 15 minutes of coming home at randomized times.
Whoa.
Than when than otherwise. Which is a huge difference.
Yeah.
Now, he only did this with a few dogs, because it's a big experience. But he did it with like 3 different dogs and owner couples who said that they had this. And so but to get into that, he noted that one of the ways that the establishment dismisses this stuff is that they say this is all anecdotal. That these people are just saying. So one his approaches was to record everything, make it not anecdotal anymore, and the other one was to actually just record it, because anecdote comes from the Greek, which just means not published. So he's like, well, I'll just publish them, and then they're not anecdotal anymore. Right?
Next time somebody tells me that what I just said is anecdotal, I'm gonna just say publish it.
Yeah, you just write it down.
I'll put it up on the website.
Isn't that weird? It's the same thing as like the thing. It was like, well, it's not written down.
Yeah.
It's not canonical.
Right.
Right? It was like, well, then just write it down. Right? When they're published, they literally cease to be anecdotes, according to the Greek word anecdotes.
That's great.
So he collected over 4,500 accounts of pet owners across the world. Via telephone surveys, internet surveys, and all these other things. And he found that this happened in around 2/3 of dogs of the people that responded to the survey. Now, of course, the people that respond to the survey are much more likely to be the people who experience this phenomenon.
Right.
Right. So that's a it doesn't mean 2/3 of all dogs do it.
I don't know, because if somebody said, "Hey, I want to do an experiment to find out if your dog is psychic," even if I didn't think my dog was psychic, I'd be curious to know what they found.
This was just like him saying, like, he was trying to get an estimate of how many people have experienced this phenomenon.
Sure.
Right. So okay. A lot of people. But so he built, when he first started his research, he built this impressive body of like anecdotes and then published them and said, well, now they're not anecdotes. They're data. Right? This is data. And the skeptics were like, come on. And they would always do what they always do with animals. And they would throw at him the tale of Clever Hans. Are you familiar with the tale of Clever Hans?
No.
So in the Berlin at the beginning of the 20th century, there was a horse named Hans.
Mm-hmm.
And Hans was said to be able to perform mathematical calculations, read German, and spell German words.
What?
He tapped out his answers with his hoof. So like his trainer, Herr von Utsten, would be like, what's 6 + 5, Hans? And Hans would start tapping, go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, until he gets to 8 or whatever the answer was. Did I say 6 × 5 or 6 + 3? I don't remember what I said. But he would tap out, and then people would be amazed because he would do this repeatedly.
Yeah.
The horse caused a sensation. Lots of professors and military officers came there. But then Clever Hans's abilities, he was named Clever Hans in the newspapers, were investigated by some professors from the University of Berlin, specifically Professor Stumpf and his assistant, Professor Funkst, because they're German.
Sure.
Stumpf, Stumpf, like stump with an F, Stumpft, and Funkst with Pfungst. And they found the horse could only give correct answers when the questioner knew the answer himself and when Hans could see the questioner. Therefore, they concluded that Hans had no mathematical abilities and could not read German. Instead, he was responding to the small body movements of the questioner that told him when he'd reached the right number, because the questioner would have some subtle indication of excitement and then he would stop. Right? Mm-hmm. And so that tale of Clever Hans, because animals, I think everyone will agree, are generally more, they notice subtle body language more.
Absolutely.
Because they communicate via body language, like dogs and horses and squirrels especially. They get out there and they flick their tail all around at each other, communicating who knows what in squirrel tail language.
Yeah.
But so everyone has since then been like, the Clever Hans has been used to dismiss so many of the unexplained abilities of animals. They attributed them to subtle cues from the people around them rather than to mysterious esoteric powers animals may have. So Clever Hans's abilities, though, it's important to note, were controversial, not because they were supposed to involve psychic powers, but because they were supposed to show that animals could think. Right? That's an important difference.
Right.
Okay. So what we're talking about here is slightly different because we're discussing not necessarily thinking, but being able to pick up on things at a distance or some form of extrasensory perception.
Yeah. This is more of a knowing question, not a
This is more of a
question.
knowing question, not of a thinking question. Also, it cannot be used as an excuse for the animal's behavior to dismiss it if there are no humans in sight for them to respond to.
Right.
Which is important. The Clever Hans effect does not work. Now, there are 3 kinds of unexplained perceptiveness that may explain this behavior in the dogs. It was seen a little less, it's seen a little bit in cats, but the effect is not as strong. And Shelbert concluded that that's probably because the cats don't care about the people as much. Which is probably, I think, honest. Dogs seem to really care about you. Like, a lot of this is, his theory is that a lot of it is based on emotional attachment. And so the dogs that have a strong emotional bond with their owner are much more likely to exhibit this. Though, listener, don't worry. If your dog's not psychic, that doesn't mean he doesn't love you. That's not what we're saying. Although maybe.
Maybe he doesn't.
Maybe he doesn't, and maybe that's your fault for being a bad person.
Yeah,
and he senses that, and so he's not excited when you come home.
Mm-hmm.
You know, which I think is something you ought to think about.
Should do some soul searching.
If your dog's not psychic, you know, you may be a Nazi or something bad. But there are 3 kinds of unexplained perceptiveness that may explain this. One is telepathy, which comes from tele-empathy, is what that comes from. It's the combination of the words tele, like for at a distance, and empathy. So feeling the same thing another person is feeling at a distance is telepathy. And people sometimes say that they experience telepathy. Like, it's not uncommon for, like, say, mothers to say that they get a distinct feeling of dread or something when their child is in danger far away.
Yeah.
That's a common story.
Twins, too. Twins
also, right. Yeah. The other one is maybe like extreme heightened sense. This is the other way to dismiss it. Extremely more sensitive primary senses, like 5 senses. So like the people are like, well, maybe they hear the car coming from like 10 miles away, or they smell the person, right? Mm-hmm. And that's how they're able to do it. And the other kind would be premonition. So premonition is different from a telepathy. Telepathy is like I'm picking up on the empathy of the feelings of the person. So the idea, if the animal is responding telepathically, it would be the person is like, finished with work, whew, good, I'm going to go home, great. And the animal picks up on that sense of relief or that sense of change, and the person is like, oh, all right, they're coming home.
Right.
And then it goes to the door. Premonitions would be like actually knowing the future.
Right.
Like the dog, he's not picking up on anything in real time. He just knows the future. And Sheldrake tested for that and distinguished between the two by having his owner, so he would have the owners he was testing on a pager. And he would be somewhere else throwing dice. So this is all, he's got video cameras on the person, the owner, who's out and about, video cameras on the dog at home. And they're all time sync. And he's got these dice, and he's throwing the dice, and it'll tell him what time to beep the person on the pager, because this was done in like the late 90s. Beep the person on the pager and tell them to come home, right? And then what he would do to test for this is every now and then he would cancel it when they were midway home and text them and say, never mind, go back. Mm-hmm. And then text them to come back later.
Okay.
And what he found was in at least 40% of these cases, I believe it was 40, may have been 60, I may have the 60-40 reversed. The dog would go to the door excitedly and wait when the person was on the way home. And then when they would stop, the dog would shortly thereafter sort of like sit down, lose his excitement and go away and then come back.
Oh, weird.
That's very strange, which makes one think that the dog is not responding. The dog doesn't simply know the future, but the dog has an emotional connection through the ether or something.
Yeah, that's a telepathic.
It's a telepathic thing.
Yeah.
Right? The other one you have to get rid of is if maybe they just have an extremely crazily sensitive sense of smell or hearing, where they could be like, because these animals would go to the door, say, usually like 10 to 15 minutes in advance of the person, like basically the period of their commute.
Right.
But so you'd have to make this work, you would have to be like, well, the animal hears you coming home from like 20 miles away. Okay. And that, frankly, to me, and I think to Sheldrake, seems more improbable than ESP.
Mm-hmm. I would agree.
Because at 20 miles away, you're going to get almost nothing. And it's going to be... You would also have to distinguish it between... If you could hear sounds from 20 miles away, you would have to be able to discern, to pick out the sound of the car returning from all the other sounds from a 20-mile radius.
Yeah.
Which is crazy.
The signal to noise ratio is terrible. If your instrument's that sensitive. It smells
even worse.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, smell doesn't... The people are in a sealed car.
Too, and it's not... Smell isn't strictly directional because you're dealing with movement of air.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so Sheldrake included that, and he included prevailing wind directions during the day and found that it made no difference. And he also tested this by having people come home and leave in different vehicles or means of conveyance. So like they would drive away in their normal car and they come home via taxi.
Oh.
Or they would leave on foot and come back on a train and then walk back home or something. He would mix and match the ways they came. And it didn't make any difference.
Wow.
To the result. Which seems to throw out the idea that because the dog may know the sound of your car, probably does, but one, he can't hear it from 20 miles away, and two, he would not respond if you were arriving via taxi, because it would be a different sound of a car.
Right.
A different car. Yeah. So that one throws that away. Right? So we seem to be left with only ESP. And further, so we've knocked out routine of the owner and the dog just knowing what time they arrive. Mm-hmm. We've knocked out premonition, and we've knocked out extreme senses of smell and hearing. But further, this has been seen especially in people. It's been reported in his anecdotes, which are no longer anecdotes because he published them, with people returning from long journeys. So like military guys that were away who come home after like a year or two.
Yeah.
And the dog, on the day of their arrival, the dog is just very excited.
Yeah.
He seems to know.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you might chalk that up to the anticipation of the people around them who do know.
Sure.
They're coming home. That could be.
Yeah.
But it also seems to work with airline attendants who are gone for like weeks at a time and come back.
Mm-hmm.
And that sort of thing. So the long and the short of this research is that controlling for all other factors, it appears as though animals are capable of telepathy. Which then implies that telepathy is a natural phenomena that humans should also be able to do. Which then implies that these stories of like ESP and whatnot that have been bandied about human culture for a long time are not as easily dismissed as possible because they're not abnormal or paranormal. We just need an expanded definition of normal.
Yeah.
Which then sort of that sort of breaks down the standard model of how science works and everything. But I think because this is on, when I say it's on video, I mean like you can go watch it. Like he's published all of these videos with his synchronized time stamps of these things happening, and like many cases of them. And in an overwhelming majority of the cases, the dog doesn't do it every time. Who knows why? Maybe some days it doesn't feel good.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe some days the owner is just in another headspace and not like I'm going home. He doesn't. Maybe he has a different emotion about going home.
Maybe
he doesn't feel good
the
about going
owner
home.
has to think about the dog for this to work.
Right. Oh, that's a good point.
It's
maybe the owner has to
two-way
think about the
street.
dog for this to
They
work.
have to be thinking about each other.
It is way beyond chance. In fact, if you know the p-values in statistics, which determine the probability that something's chance or not.
Yeah.
The p-value for this study was it was 0.000001
Yeah.
chance that it was.
Yeah.
Right. But yet still skeptics would be like, no, it's impossible.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, he had a skeptic come out and reproduce who he was one of these James Randi characters, although he wasn't James Randi, he was a different guy. He said, this is bunk. And he said, okay, well, you come out and you do the tests with my owner dog subjects. And he did. And he found exactly the same results. His data was the same. And he published the data that was the same. But then when he published it, same graphs, same charts, he said, it's probably nothing. Because there's no room.
Now we have the truth of his objection.
Right. There's no room in his headcanon for this to work.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Which is the tortured way I segue that into the canon talk before.
Mm-hmm.
Because were they related? Only in my head canon, they were the same. And, why do you not enter? Because I do not see myself as outside. There you go.
There you go.
I think it's very fair. I think it's very, very fair. Now, to finish the show, we actually have an interview. Did you know that?
No, I had no idea.
Yeah, I interviewed last night Matthew Kressel from some time ago. We talked about his book Dark Skies.
Yeah, man. I remember that guy.
And I enjoy talking to him for many reasons. One, we just talked about this canon stuff. He's a fan. He's a guy that is a fan.
Yeah.
Like he is in fandoms.
Mm-hmm.
But I like him because he has, as I said to him, he has taken fandom to an almost academic level.
Yeah.
And written like academic papers about it and stuff. And I also like talking to him because his political positions and ideological positions are, except for on the subject that we both agree there's something fishy about UFOs and JFK, are 100% 80 degrees the opposite of mine. And so I like to talk to him occasionally to keep myself talking to someone, to keep myself grounded.
Sure. Yeah, yeah.
Right? Because he thinks that like COVID is real and like the moon, the earth is this ball and that, Julia Childs was a woman.
Yeah, he's a good foil for you. Yeah.
Yeah, he thinks Julia Child was a woman and that Helen Keller was actually blind.
Sure.
And all these other insane, and nuclear bombs are real.
Yeah.
And all these other insane positions, right, that he has.
Mm-hmm.
But it's good. And I don't argue with him about it during the interview because it's impolite to argue with your guest. And also, I just want to let someone else talk and be like, yeah, this is the true stuff.
Yeah.
Just to give balance.
Sure.
Just to give balance. And so we talked about Canon, and it was sort of a rough discussion because I was still trying to work through like why was I even curious about this? Because there's something nagging at me about like why it was an issue.
Yeah. And
he helped me think about why it's an issue. And we laughed at QAnon together, and all that stuff. So that'll be after this. Now it is like an hour or something long, so this is going to be a very long show on your Spotify.
All right,
but don't worry about that. You've got nothing else to do, loser. Dude, see, I have to attack the audience.
Get a life, dorks.
But I actually love them. But this helps me. Attacking them prevents the emotional connection that would make me have telepathy for them.
Right.
You see? And then if I had telepathy for them, then when I told them things like, listen, your entire history and worldview is wrong, and they felt bad about it, I would feel bad and be unable to tell them properly. You understand?
Yeah. And plus the sanctity of the privacy of your own mind would be violated.
But it would be violated, and I would be unable to perform my counter worldview Warcraft espionage.
Right.
against the Jesuits if I didn't maintain animosity with our audience.
He keeps you at a distance because he loves you, listener.
Yeah, I keep you at a distance, and I must insult you because I love you. And that's why, and every insult should remind you to donate to the St. Nicholas Project. Every single insult, you should be like, and I must go.
By the way, my desk is covered in flash drives right now that are about to go out to our...
That's true.
Our subscribers that sent me their address. So the Canon on the flash drives is officially closed.
Ooh, that's true. We're closing the Canon.
You've missed the deadline.
Did we? Because is the lost episode that's on the jump drives? Is that Canon? Dun 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 dun.
No, I mean,
you never get away from this problem.
The canon of who's getting a flash drive is officially closed.
Okay,
but they will go out in the coming week. I have not forgotten. Don't worry. See, you can hear the crinkliness of the plastic wrapping.
Yeah. Now, we were going to do something fun and have like a novelty jump drive, but those were too expensive.
Well,
and
they were too small.
Hold enough storage.
They didn't have enough storage space. So you're going to get...
That was the main issue. We were going to spend the money on you guys that we don't have because you don't give money.
Right.
But they were too small. It was they didn't have enough storage space.
Yeah.
There was one that was like a red pill, like a capsule. Mm-hmm. And they would be like, you got the red pill.
You got the red pill. It was going to be great.
And then there was one that was like a cork bottle.
It was a glass bottle with a cork in the mouth of the bottle, or the neck of the bottle, and then the flash drive was embedded in the cork, which was cool. I was going to put locks of our hair in there and all sorts of weird, maybe some chicken bones, something freak you guys out.
I wasn't going to give my hair because then they might clone us or get our DNA.
Yeah.
I was going to put like an animal hair.
I was going to put somebody else's hair in it. Yeah.
Or maybe I really would put Bigfoot hair in it.
But it wouldn't.
I have access to something that someone claims is Bigfoot hair.
Awesome.
Now, I've never done experiments on it to see, nor has anyone else. But someone claims it. Now, does it look a bit like alpaca fur to me? Yes. But does that mean it's not Bigfoot hair? No.
Yeah.
So.
But none of that's actually going to happen because you're getting a somewhat standard flash drive.
Yeah, they just don't make novelty flash drives with enough storage for our purposes. Is the problem?
Yeah, there's like how
many bytes was it?
I'm not done like compiling everything, but I think it's going to come in around like 20 gigs or something.
That's a lot of gigs. Yeah. It's a lot of bits.
Yep.
A lot of
electrons headed your way, guys.
Yeah, this is why I hate iTunes, because every time you turn on your computer, iTunes goes, I will now download 37 gigabytes of podcasts that you didn't ask me to. And I try to stop it, and I go in there and I say, don't do this.
Don't do it.
And it says, okay. And then it does an update, and it says, I'm doing it again.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I never update my computer.
It's good policy.
My Mac has not been updated since 2014.
The Canon is closed on your Mac.
The Canon is closed on my Mac, except for the
system.
Viruses that people introduce because it is not updated.
Which is there's a great metaphor in its own right.
Exactly, isn't it though?
Yeah.
I've closed the Canon in one way, and that opens me up to viruses and to additions to the Canon in another way.
Yeah.
Which is why The Sound of the Rain needs no translations. Just listen to Jesus, who did that, who sort of said that in a roundabout way, but really didn't. But you know what I mean.
I don't, but here comes interview with Matthew Kressel.
Da da da. Da, da, da. Long time no talk to. Hello, how are you doing?
You.
Oh, I'm doing well. Last we talked, I believe we had just started to worry about dying from coronavirus as a culture.
Yes, it was middle of last summer, if memory serves.
Yes. Did you survive?
Yes.
Good. And you feel how do you feel now?
Feeling pretty good, all things considered.
Good.
Oh.
Good. Yeah. So for people who don't know, Matthew Kressel is an author and a guy that has taken, I think, like being a fan and fandom to like an academic level. Would you agree?
I don't know if I'd go quite that far. I think there's some people who've taken it even further than I have, to be honest. But yeah, I
But you just started your career, really.
That's fair, I suppose. I mean, I do have a book about the Dark Skies TV series that came out last year, and I've written essays about Doctor Who and Star Trek and X-Files for various books called the Outside In series. So it might be a fair thing to say. I don't know if I would go quite so far as to say that, though.
Right. Well, yeah, I want to talk to you because I had this question, and I thought Matthew would know an answer to this. About like what makes something canonical or canon, and why does it matter so much to people? Because I was talking with someone about the new Matrix movies. That's how this started.
Okay.
And they were talking about they were talking about some random comic and why the video games were, and like this. They were all upset. This movie they thought wasn't going to like incorporate this stuff from the past. And whether it will or not, who knows? Right. But they got sort of emotionally angry and involved about it. And some level I was like, well, okay, but if it's a good movie, who would care?
Right.
And then it struck me that this was the same thing as like, it's sort of the same thing on a smaller scale as like arguing what goes in the Bible or not. Like what's canon, right?
Right. Well, that's where the term canon actually comes from.
Right. Yeah. So you just got back from a Doctor Who convention,
yes,
correct?
I did.
Now, Doctor Who is a franchise with a great deal of questions about canon, unless I'm mistaken.
No, I think that's a fair assessment.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So give me some examples of some problems that crop up in Doctor Who, and then like how, because you're very connected with the Doctor Who fan base, right? And then how do they resolve it? And then because like there's this thing that goes on where like I've done this with various things. I realize like you have like a headcanon, like your own idea.
Yeah.
And then if the quote unquote official thing deviates too much, you just like, you ignore that.
Right.
You throw that away. And then you get like these, it's like splinter groups of, it's like splinter sects or something like that. So like, give me some examples from Doctor Who where this comes up.
So some examples from Doctor Who, the thing to keep in mind about Doctor Who is that for the first 18, 19 years it was running, nobody was really paying attention to continuity at all. Canon as we know of it today basically didn't exist. One of my favorite things about Doctor Who along those lines is the fact that it took 6 years into the show's run before we found out the Doctor was a Time Lord, and another 4 or 5 years after that before we found out the Time Lords were from the planet Gallifrey, and they were literally making stuff up as they went along. So one of the neat things about that is, and this actually talks about the way that writers rewrite themselves. Terry Nation, who's the creator of the Daleks, in the very first Dalek story aired in late 1963, early 1964, we get one particular origin for the Daleks, that they used to be a people called the Dals, D-A-L-S, before they ended up in these travel machines that became the Daleks. 11 or 12 years later, in 1975, there's a story that's aired called Genesis of the Daleks, again written by Terry Nation, in which we find out that the Daleks were originally called Kaleds, K-A-L-E-D-S, or it's an anagram of Dalek.
Right.
And they were created by Davros during this war, and they were genetically modified. Whereas in the original version, they had been mutated by radiation, and that was why they had to survive in the shells and everything else. Also, one of the big things from those early days is that the Daleks ran on static electricity, which conveniently got forgotten about after about 1967. Because there's a long gap in the show's history, about 5 years between 1967 and 1972, where there's not a single Dalek episode.
Right.
They just don't feature at all. So that's one of them. Another big one is because of the fact that it took 6 years before anybody decided that the Doctor was a Time Lord, In the very first episode of the show, An Unearthly Child aired November the 23rd, 1963, there's a big insinuation that the Doctor created the TARDIS. And indeed, his granddaughter, Susan, says, "Oh, I made up the name from the initials, time and relative dimensions in space." Whereas as time goes on, and particularly by the mid-70s, it's suddenly a Type 40 TARDIS, and the TARDISes have been around since the Time Lord civilization got the ability to time travel.
Okay, yeah, big difference.
Big difference. Another example is from the same story, The War Games, that introduced the fact that the Doctor was a Time Lord. Patrick Troughton's second Doctor has a line at one point that says, "Oh, we're basically immortal, barring accidents." And then a few years later, there's a story set on Gallifrey called The Deadly Assassin, where it's like, "Oh, you get 12 regenerations and 13 lives, and that's it."
Right.
Which is a bit of a contradiction in terms. So those are just some examples from the show's early years. And then around season 1819, so this is the early 80s, a chap named Ian Levine was brought in for a bit, and he became the show's official continuity supervisor. And his kind of job was, he had kind of ingratiated himself with the production team of the era, was that he would basically be sent scripts and whatnot, or get asked for advice on, we're thinking about featuring the Cybermen this story. If we wanted to feature clips of old Cybermen stories, which episode should we go for? That kind of thing.
Right.
But he did have kind of a way of making some changes happen. There's a story called State of Decay where they changed the name of the spaceship in the story because it had been featured in the Doctor Who story from 1972. He sticks around till about the mid 80s, and along the lines, the show does get up to some continuity hijinks where it gets really obsessed with its own past, kind of for a while. There's infamously a story called Attack of the Cybermen, where they basically railroaded in references to every Cyberman story that had aired in the previous 19 years.
Okay, trying to force a continuity.
That's one way of looking at it. And they did a whole thing about, well, the first Cyberman story was supposed to be set in 1986, and we're making this story in 1984 to be broadcast in 1985. Let's tie into that, but let's also tie into this story that doesn't exist in the archives at the moment that everybody loves. It was a hot mess of a story, and in some ways, in my view, kind of the beginning of the end of classic Doctor Who, because it's a show that basically became obsessed with its own history at the expense of actually telling good stories. And so those are some kind of examples from the show's early years in particular.
Yeah, see, that's a good point. Like, it's because I guess you've hit on a couple things. Like, a canon, I guess the purpose of it is to serve as continuity.
Yeah.
Like, to connect past events to present to future. Is the point of and to tell people like what's in and what's out. But then on a different level, like I was saying, like, if it's a good, why does that so often why does that not being there invalidate the story? Right? Like, that's
right. I think I get what you're saying.
Yeah. Like, if that's not there, or if that falls apart for people, they will, like, Buffy the Vampire Slayer famously had this happen. We're like, I think it was at the end of there was the end of the first run, and then they did a little bit extra. And in between, all the fans came up with a very, like, really nicely tight, everything was really good answers to all the plot line holes and everything.
Yeah.
It seemed to answer everything. And then Joss Whedon got up there the next day and was like, "Oh no, that's all nothing." And people got so angry about it. A lot of people that was the end of the show, really. That was why there was no more of them later. Because this, like, the people that cared about the show had built up this giant thing about it, and then, but then when that continuity was broken, they could no longer care about the show. And I don't, in some sense, I understand that, but I also, it's an interesting sort of philosophical question of why we need that so badly.
I think part of it, and I say this as a writer as well as a fan of things, I think a lot of it is, why are we into stories to begin with? I mean, we're there because we enjoy stories, and we like getting invested in those in worlds and I guess universes at this point. You know, we want to go along on journeys with these characters. We want to explore more of these worlds. I think it's a big part of the appeal of, you know, comic book universes and science fiction universes that go places and do things that you can't do here on Earth. So I think that that's part of it. And I think part of it, too, is that picking up on what you were saying about Buffy the Vampire Slayer, similar things have happened with other shows. You know, you think about the way shipping, as it's known, becomes big parts of fandom.
Yeah.
And people are like, well,
define shipping real quick for people.
So shipping, basically, it comes out of the term relationship. And it's basically, it's a particularly fan obsession with pairing particular characters together. So on particularly Stargate SG-1 is a good example of that. Jack O'Neill and Samantha Carter, who ended up kind of sort of becoming canon later on as the Stargate franchise went along, especially on TV. It's sort of where that comes from. Mulder and Scully, for example, on the X-Files, towards the end. And of course, once they actually did it, nobody seemed particularly happy with it.
Right. It was better in fantasy.
It was better in fantasy.
Yeah.
But picking up on what you were saying there isn't such a thing as fanon, which is kind of this fan-created canon. And you see a lot of that echoing even now in particularly Star Trek fandom. Because when Star Trek was off the air throughout the 1970s, before we got the first movie, and eventually, you know, what is it? More than a half a dozen TV shows at this point.
Yes.
But while the show was off air and there wasn't anything kind of official coming out, people filled in the gaps themselves. And I think that that's just a very human thing to want to do with storytelling, especially if there's not more stories there and you want them. Your instinct, and I say this as a writer, is to go write them yourself. Right. But what sometimes happens is that the fandom picks up on things created outside of the official canon. Uhura's first name being, and I can't pronounce it, so this is a bad example, was something that came out of Star Trek fanon that's ended up now making its way into the canon with the J.J. Abrams reboot films, and now apparently with her on Strange New Worlds when it comes out, hopefully next year. So that's an example of that. Right. I think, as I said, a lot of it has to do with fan investment in things, and particularly when things aren't on the air either, because Doctor Who had a 15-year period where there were basically no new episodes being made. You know, we had one TV movie that aired in 96. We had some for charity stuff.
Hold on 1 second. Sorry. Okay, 1 second. I had someone. Hold on. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I don't know, baby. Go ahead. Hey, sorry about that.
No, it's okay.
Yeah, so continue. I'm sorry.
So Doctor Who had this 15-year period when there was nothing on air being made. There was one TV movie and some, particularly for charity stuff. So in that time, there ended up being multiple book ranges running at the same time. 4 major ones, 2 apiece being put out by 2 different companies. Virgin in the in the first half of the 90s, BBC Books in the second half of the 90s, going into the early 2000s. Big Finish started doing their audio dramas, and what basically happened was that everybody looked at that version of basically picked the version of the expanded universe. It became a choose your own universe, as it were, as to which one was the legitimate continuation of the show. And there are still people arguing about this to this day. You know, 30 years after the first books came out, there's still people arguing whether those books are canon or not. And part of it is that I think people get emotionally invested in the things that continue the story for them, whether it's at an impressionable age or it's just what their version of who those characters and storylines ought to be.
Yeah, and I was thinking about, because like I said, you know, our show, we talk about religion a lot sometimes and philosophy of that. And that it struck me that was the same process as like the different branches of Christianity, say, have several different canons of what goes in the Bible. And then on top of that, for all the stuff that's not mentioned, like what was Jesus doing when he was little, or what happened to Joseph, they've there's this huge body of work of like people just making it up. Like just, and then some of it people get so attached to it that it comes to be part of the religion.
Right.
It's like fandom that's crossed over into canon.
Mm.
And I think what you said was like, it depends on like, it has to continue the story for you in some way.
Yeah.
Like if it breaks, it's a hard thing to put a finger on, but it's like, if you can't connect to the story, then you reject the canon or something like that.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. And, and there's people who will look at the contradictions in things and, will get upset if this doesn't acknowledge this.
Yeah.
And that kind of thing. Or, if somebody decides, well, here's the real story going on behind this particular bit from this. And again, I think a lot of it has to do with emotional attachment. Star Wars fandom is a great example of this.
Mm-hmm.
What happened when, Disney, having bought out Lucasfilm, said, we're going to make a sequel trilogy and we're going to make more films. The easiest way for them to do that was they basically had to say, we know that there's been decades worth of all these expanded universe stories, novels, comics, you name it, a good chunk of which are self-contradictory anyway.
Right.
So why don't we just ignore that and we'll carry on? What had happened, though, was that people had gotten really invested in those characters and in the things that have been created around that universe for those books. Whether it's, Thrawn leading the Empire post Return of the Jedi or, people having kids and that kind of thing. And people, get very upset when it's like a sense of an invalidation of things. With religion, I think it's an even bigger thing, particularly the way faith works, particularly if you invest in it a lot. But there is, I say this as somebody who's agnostic. It's hard not to look at a lot of things like Joseph of Arimathea and the Holy Grail ending up in the UK somewhere.
Right.
Which feels like if that's not an effort at fan fiction, I don't know what is.
Yeah, it is definitely an effort at fan fiction. Like everyone tried to write themselves into this biblical story.
Mm.
Right? The Irish would have this legend that like Joseph of Arimathea he landed in Wales or something, and he started a monastery, and then he came over to Ireland and like planted a tree, and this tree was there still, and everyone would do this like sort of it's fanfic, but like,
well, you get it too with like the medieval obsession with shrines and icons and that kind of thing. Everybody's got a piece of wood from the cross. Everybody's got a nail. Yes. Somebody's got the shroud. Somebody's got the crown of thorns. Everybody had to have a piece of the pie.
Yeah,
and I think part of it was an attempt at legitimizing themselves. But it's also, not only legitimizing themselves as, see, we have this, we deserve a bit of the pie here, but also I think just kind of saying, well, we're important in the grand scheme of things too.
Yeah. And I guess this is the question I've been struggling with is like, is the fan fiction of religion or fan fiction in general bad, or is that actually part of the process of the universe making? Like, where does the authority end with like what is canon? Like, say the who is in control of like what is canon for Doctor Who? Say, because there's many writers, many directors.
Yeah, well, that's the fun thing about Doctor Who is that to this day there is no set canon.
And who could set it? Like, who could do it?
It would take somebody at the BBC itself.
Okay.
But having said that, we've had 3 different showrunners, with one of them fixing to come back into that seat again. So 4 different production teams, basically, and everybody's had their own ideas of how things work.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody picking different things from expanded media and from classic Who and saying, well, I'm going to play with this element. So in that case, and the same thing happened with Star Trek, because, there was a very set idea of what was canon in Star Trek until after Gene Roddenberry died.
Right.
And that all happened too. And of course, now with Star Wars, George Lucas, I think himself said, he was grateful that, people were enjoying the expanded universe stuff, but it's not necessarily what he would want to do. And if he wanted to ignore it, if he ever made a sequel trilogy, he would, which is why I sometimes scratch my head at the way some people have gotten upset about what ended up being done in said sequel trilogy, albeit Lucas not making. With Doctor Who, nobody has ever put their foot down and said, this bit's canon, this bit's not canon. Paul Cornell, who's a writer who worked on Doctor Who throughout the Russell T Davies era and has written countless books, comics, audios, you name it. If there's a medium, he's probably written for Doctor Who in it. Likes to say that with Doctor Who, everything is canon and nothing is canon. You know, Doctor Who is the ultimate example of head canon. Because what's canon at that moment is in the head of the showrunner writing the show for that 2 or 3 year period. So, I mean, that's what's happened at the moment with the big story arc with the Timeless Child that's gotten a chunk of the fandom up in arms, the seeds of which have been laid back as far back as the 1970s. But it's stuff that had been ignored by some people. There were people like me for whom all of the elements kind of going into it that had been seeded back there were all part of the headcanon. But it was one of those things that people could choose to accept or ignore until somebody came along, in this case, Chris Chibnall, and said, nope, this is canon. Whether you like it or not, it's canon. And there's at least a very vocal group of people who don't like it. Whether they're a majority or not, I honestly can't say.
Didn't the recent Doctor Who Flux itself sort of flaunt it because it was like more than 13 incarnations?
Well, I mean, that had been around for a while before that, too. So there's a story from 1975 called The Brain of Morbius. And there's a competition in that story between the Doctor and a renegade Time Lord turned into a Frankenstein monster creation thing called Morbius. And they challenge each other to kind of a mind duel. And they go through Morbius' previous incarnation, and then we see the Tom Baker's Doctor followed by the 3 previous Doctors, and all of a sudden there's like 5 or 6 new faces that nobody's ever seen before that pop up, and Morbius goes, back to your beginning, Doctor, how long have you lived? The funny thing is that story in that particular bit was written by a writer named Robert Holmes, who then turned around less than a year later and a handful of episodes later and said, nope, Time Lords have 12 regenerations and 13 lives. So it's another case in point of writers contradicting themselves. It's whatever's good for the story at that moment.
Yeah, and I think if you take say the Quran or the Bible, it also appears to have contradictions in it, like any big book, right? And it seems like headcanon and fanon and like all of the little stories that people write are efforts to try and, I don't know, resolve this. Like there's a big need for it all to be very like something you care about to be neat, and like you can't. It doesn't work for like I had this happen with me with are you familiar with the Halo video games?
I've heard of them. I'm not a huge gamer, but I am very much aware of them.
Right. When I was in high school and college, I played them a lot. And it was obvious to me with the first 3 that they were hinting at something like, because there's the story the humans are fighting the aliens and whatnot, and the aliens worship this dead species they're trying to reconnect and go transcend to, right? Okay. And it's obvious throughout the game that there's subtle clues that species they worship is the humans that they're fighting. Right, it's like blatant at some point, you know. And but then the company that originally made it, Bungie, sold the franchise to another company, and they came out with 4, and then they just totally undid all of it. And I was like, well, what is the? Then it doesn't. All of the previous stuff doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't go. And then you're like, well, why? Then I was like, well, why do I care about it now? And it's so stupid. Because it is just a dumb video game. And yet, having a nothing continuity just breaks it. Like having like no ability to connect. Like, well, it doesn't. Even the meaning you can put in a video game is gone. And I don't. Yeah.
I think, again, it goes back to emotional investment in stories. You know, Tom Clancy used to say that the difference between fact and fiction was that fiction had to make sense. And
yes, that's true.
I think we're attracted to storytelling in part because it has a beginning, middle, and end, which real life often doesn't. It's plain, it's in its most basic form, it's very uncomplicated. It doesn't have contradictions. It's a straight through line, beginning, middle, and end. The problem, I think, becomes when you have to then do as one has to do in real life, which is deal with the contradictions of things. And again, fan can whether it's canon in Doctor Who or expanded universe novels or in Star Wars, you name it, people get invested in things. And and like religion becomes a big part of people's lives, and fandom becomes as well. I can speak to that from personal experience. And people have their own neat little versions of how the universe is supposed to work. When you overturn somebody's belief system in the case of religion, or somebody's idea of how the universe is supposed to work in the case of fandom, though I suppose you could apply that in real life, right? If you think about, the Catholic Church 500-600 years ago.
Right.
Galileo and Bruno, I'm looking at you. I think that when you do that, I don't want to say offend, because that's a very strong term, but I really don't know how else to word it. Sensibilities come into play. Everybody's got their own version of how things are supposed to be. And what I tend to find with it is that some people are more fluid with that. Some people are open to interpretation. Some people are very much, no, this is how things are supposed to be. And it goes back to that same argument of, fundamentalism versus evangelicalism, how and where the two kind of intermingle. And that's true whether it's true of religion or whether it's true of fandom. And again, I think the boiled down issue to it is not just why we get invested. We get invested in stories.
Yeah. You have like we said, you have a beginning, middle, and end. And is it that, so like real life, like the world we live in doesn't, to our experience, have a beginning, middle, and end. I mean, it does in our own lives, like we born and we die.
Right.
But we don't really experience either of those too much. And then like, we know there's more before us and we know there's more after us.
Right.
Do we need a closed system to make sense of it? And that's why we get upset about it. Like we have to, because like in religion, you always come up with a beginning, like in the beginning, and then there's an end, like one day. Or you have if you're a Western religion or an Eastern religion, makes it a closed loop.
Yeah.
You have to make it a contained thing in order to make meaning out of it, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, it's been said before, try imagining infinity. Well, what is infinity? Infinity just goes on and on and on.
How do you make a story out of infinity?
Exactly. There's a great quote from a recent Doctor Who audio I listened to that said, if you tell any story long enough, everything ends in death.
Yeah.
But the thing about storytelling is that it doesn't have to end in death. People don't have to age. People can keep on going and going and going, which, spoilers for the most recent James Bond film, No Time to Die, but there's a good chunk of the Bond fandom that's very upset about the idea that, oh my God, James Bond has actually died. Which suddenly occurred to me, having been a Bond fan since I was in my teens, but having never looked at it that way, for how many people that Bond is kind of this ultimate fantasy figure.
Right.
Which is certainly never how I viewed the character. I mean, I watch the films and I enjoy them, but I don't do it for purely escapist fantasy. I do them, as sort of an enjoyable couple of hours. But I don't think I realized until recently, when that film came out and the reactions to the ending, how many people project themselves into the place of Bond in those films, which if you think about how often he gets shot at, beaten up, etc., you do have to wonder about some people. But that's the same thing about a lot of this, is a lot of people identify with characters. I mean, the big arguments happening across pop culture and in creative communities at the moment about diversity and representation are kind of valid for that reason. How much do you give people the ability to see themselves in a story and with these characters? And again, it's the same thing. And a lot of the investment I find with a lot of this stuff also comes out to people come to things at particular moments in their lives. Sometimes it's things that they grew up with, especially in the case of a lot of the Star Wars stuff or the 90s Doctor Who novels, say. These are things that people grew up with. And I think that having a sense that that's all been invalidated, that you've wasted your life doing all of that.
It like breaks your childhood to some degree, a lot of people feel.
Right. I mean, it's
Which
also
is weird, but they feel that way.
Well, you also, I mean, going back to what got us together to begin with, think about the UFO field and people who spent years and decades on cases, some of which ended up being quite obvious hoaxes. Nobody ever wanted to admit it because it would mean that you had spent years or longer of years and decades of your life invested in something that had no meaning. And frankly, nobody enjoys that.
Right.
But, I think, too, as well, that part of what's happened is that storytelling has become corporatized. If you think about the ownership of things like Star Trek and Star Wars, even Doctor Who, which is owned by the BBC, though they license huge chunks of it out. I think there was a point in time when we sat around the campfire and we told each other stories. Or, you wrote something down and you sent it to your friend. If you think about the way, say, the Arthurian mythos grew up, happened for exactly that reason. It's people sitting around fires or, what's his name, who wrote Le Morte Arthur, Sir Thomas More. No, it's not Sir Thomas More. Who is it? It's going to bug me. I can't remember that now. Mallory, maybe? Whoever wrote it. Yeah.
Yes, I think you're right, Mallory. Yeah.
So, Mallory writing Le Morte d'Arthur, for example, but there's also the various, the French from the French writings of the Arthurian legends, which is where we get Lancelot from. And people could take that and they could build it. But you didn't have a set canon where everybody's version had to interact with everybody else. Until it did, which in that case, you get what's happened with the Arthurian legends, from Tennyson on to the present day, where everybody kind of picks and chooses what they want from it to tell. But the difference there is that I think for some reason, people can accept multiple Sherlock Holmes. They can accept multiple King Arthurs running around, Robin Hood, you name it. But for some reason, when it comes, and maybe it's because of the way we now work, we've become very visual as a society. In the way that we used to read things, we now watch things more and more. I think maybe it's because of that idea of a shared experience as well. That has now been taken from a grand scale. It used to be, people are reading a book in isolation, or it's whoever's sitting around the campfire with you as you tell your story. Today, basically anybody and everybody has access to the same media.
Right.
And can kind of do what they want with it. But the problem kind of with that is that unlike, say, with the early Arthurian stuff, where everybody was basically working in isolation, or somebody would eventually sit down and try to distill it all into one thing, years and years, if not centuries and centuries later, today it's all happening in real time. And it's happening on that most wonderful of medium to get your point across clearly and succinctly, the internet.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, because in the past, is the need for a set canon a product of technology? Because as you were pointing out, and I've noticed this too, reading history of religion and stuff and church fathers. In the past, they didn't. What was canonical in the Bible didn't seem to matter too much. They had a collection of writings they all revered, but it wasn't set in stone, and no one really seemed that upset about it if you disregarded one or the other. It's totally different than what you think. And that seemed to change around the printing press time. When there's mass production of it, and just like you were saying with Arthurian legend and stuff, or with the diversity question that we have coming up now, in the past, if you were telling the story around the campfire, you would just imagine the characters however you wanted.
Yeah.
Like you probably. Right? But when it's a visual medium, that stops, it somehow constricts the story's universality, maybe?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah. So is the worrying about canon itself just like an issue created by the media and the medium it's being served through?
Possibly. I mean, before the printing press came around, medieval scholars used to debate how many, angels could dance on the head of a pen, for example.
Sure.
And certainly things like the Council of Nicaea, which is, become even more famous now thanks to Dan Brown of the Da Vinci Code.
Right.
All of that predates the technology. But I think I hate to keep harping on the point, investment in storytelling.
Yeah.
And sort of everybody, the idea that there needs to be a singular vision of things. Again, because we want a definitive beginning, middle, and end. And we want, also another thing about storytelling too, is that it's there to explain things.
Which is its main function, I think. Yeah. Right.
Which is, it's there to entertain, but it's also there to transmit ideas and concepts. Mm-hmm. It's a reason why reading in particular is very good at developing empathy for people, because it makes you put yourself in somebody else's shoes.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's where a lot of it comes from. And of course, though it is perhaps telling, as you say, that once the printing press comes around, you do get the Thurian Reformation, and you do get the rise of Protestantism in a big way that hadn't really existed prior to that point. What started out as academic debate suddenly spills out into the real world with very real world consequences.
Because your average peasant didn't care or know that these things were even problems. And then but then we're all trying to, it's like people used to be very accepted. Like you could say in the UK, for example, Joseph of Arimathea was here, and everyone's like, yeah, of course he was. Right. And that didn't seem crazy at all. But then when everyone's trying to mesh their stories together, it becomes like, well, they all can't have happened.
Right. You end up with some very strange things like Jesus going to Tibet during his 7 missing years or whatever it is.
Yeah, the Yoga Sutras of Jesus, the Jesus Sutra. Yeah.
And, again, the part of that feels like an attempt to fit what that particular person or group's particular interests are into something else.
I would say I would say that's mostly Mormonism. Like America needs to be put into the Bible somehow. So Jesus came here.
Yeah.
And it's like a fan fiction that's then added on. And then, but I guess the fact that what's amazing is the fact that those sorts of things can take off. It's like, well, yeah. And then even though it seems to contradict everything else, it's crazy. I don't know. It's this idea of like what comes together as a canon for people.
Yeah.
And why it matters.
Yeah. I mean, we could, there's a whole library's worth of psychology stuff that's been written on the nature of belief.
Yeah.
And particular things that influence people to believe things at that particular moment. It's, particularly when people are in isolation or people are emotionally distressed or things don't make sense about things. And I can kind of speak to that myself as a former 9/11 truther. I look back on those days and kind of go, good God, Matt, how in the world did you ever believe these things? But people still do believe those things.
Right.
But I can kind of look back on it and go, well, I was in a very particular situation in my life, and this was the world around me at the time.
Right.
And at that moment, it didn't seem like too much of a stretch being presented with this interpretation of things that, oh, that's a way it could have been. That then becomes, oh, that's the way it was.
Right. You make your own head canon.
Yeah.
Based to provide continuity for yourself, really.
Yeah.
And then that's why there can never really be widespread agreement on things.
Yeah. I mean, there's Stacy Smith, who's my editor on the Outside In books, likes to say that if you put 10 fans into a room, you're going to get 11 opinions.
Yeah.
And that's true of most fields of human endeavor. Right. I find whether it's the canon that we're talking about here, or back in the day, how we were going to get people to the moon, and these days, how we're going to get people back to the moon and then on to Mars. Everybody's got their own way of doing things. A lot of that is perspective on the world and on how things work. And, and again, we get invested in ideas. and we want things to work out in a very particular way. The reasons for which oftentimes are very personal to us as individuals, and that will make no logical sense to anybody else but us.
Yeah.
But on the same time, there's a great saying that John le Carré, the late great John le Carré, said, talking about people building into the delusions of things like in his novel, The Tailor of Panama, and in real life later playing out with, say, the invasion of Iraq, and the way that particularly the US and British governments utterly convinced themselves that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction on what was later flimsy evidence. And he has a great phrase for it, which is people reach across to their fields of madness, and they infect one another.
Right.
And what you often have, and I've experienced this myself, as I said, with my 9/11 truther thing, is that you have people with the seeds of ideas, and you have people with a bunch of dots that they can't connect. And somebody comes along and says, here's how we connect the dots. Mm-hmm. This is how you get from point A to point B to point C to point Z by the time you're over with. And that's the great appeal of that, I think.
If you're the first person to do that for them, you sort of like implant an immovable idea in their head.
Yeah.
Because we've all got these dots, and then like but how you connect them you can connect them anyway.
Right.
But then people come in, there's like infinite ways to connect them. It's like storytelling is reality in a way.
Yeah. Well, perception is reality. Mm-hmm. And often, when perception doesn't fit reality, there's a great line from Doctor Who. The Fourth Doctor says in a story called Face of Evil that the very powerful and the very stupid have one thing in common: that when the facts don't fit reality, they change the facts to suit their reality.
Right.
Right. I've had to paraphrase that because I don't think because I couldn't remember the exact wording, but we see that happen quite a bit in the real world, whether it's with the fandom and things or with people's opinions about, any number of hot topic issues I won't name here.
Right.
But we often see where people pick and choose their facts. And, you talk about the way that you can connect infinite dots. I often think that's a big part of the appeal of conspiracy theories. And, just look at something like the JFK assassination, where those dots have been connected in so many different and contradictory ways that they can't all possibly be true. But there's perhaps an underlying truth behind them. And the same, I think, is true, too, of the UFO phenomenon, for that matter, as well, that all of these various conspiracy theories can't possibly be true, but there may be somewhere buried behind all the white noise, as it were, there may actually be a little kernel of truth, if I may mix my metaphors.
Yeah, and it's also like say, take your JFK thing, it's like a question of well, who gets to decide what the official story is? Who gets to decide what the official connected dots is? Yeah. Because people are well, just because these people over in Washington say this is how the dots are connected. Yeah. Which is sort of the Protestant Reformation. The Pope says they're connected like this, but why does that matter? And then you really don't have an answer for that unless the person agrees that person is the authority. Right. And authority means author. It's like the one that authors the story. Yeah. So it's like, who's the author of this story that we're trying to tell ourselves? Yeah. And today, though, with the rise of fandoms and particularly the idea of literary criticism, which in some ways I think gives rise to the modern fandom, the idea that just because the author says something doesn't mean that that's actually the case. There's a wonderful phrase I've come across called the fallacy of authorial intent. Which is that even though the author meant the story in this particular way, you can read the story and go, that can't be how that played out for X, Y, and Z reasons. Yeah. But it's a case in point, too, where the theory becomes the fact. Whether it's actually what actually was intended or what actually occurred is entirely dependent in the mind of the person sitting there, whoever you are looking at a particular topic. Yeah, and that's sort of playing out on a societal scale, and I think that's why society's fragmenting, because you can't. It's like if there's no objective author of like how the dots connect, and even if the author means it one way, it doesn't have to be. Then it's like everyone just is running their own headcanon about everything.
Yeah,
which is sort of why views of no one can agree on anything now in like the public sphere. Because everyone's running like 78 different headcanons.
Yeah.
And there's no agreement on, we even tossed out the idea that there could be a definitive author. Right? And so then what do you do?
Well, I think it comes back to, and I think the thing is that's happened on small scale.
Yeah.
Forever.
True.
It's always kind of been there. What's happened, I think, in the last, at least in my lifetime, because I'm in my early 30s now. Mm-hmm. What's happened in my lifetime, I think I can objectively say, is going back to what you talk about, medium and technology, the rise of the internet.
Right.
And the internet gave, as it were, the village crazies and the village idiots the ability to link up.
Uh-huh.
And to suddenly go from people in isolation, again, to use Le Carré's phrase, they could reach out across their fields of madness and infect somebody else.
Right. But like
that's given rise to conflicting narratives about, dear God, anything and everything, it feels like.
But they almost seem validated when you're like, but the official story about, like, say, the weapons of mass destruction wasn't true.
Yeah.
We got all this. And then it's like, well, then who is telling the truth? Maybe it's crazy. And people are like, well, maybe this guy is telling the truth. And then, but yeah, so the internet has given, it's basically allowed everyone to connect the dots in a different way and then just tell the public,
yeah,
here's an alternative way of connecting the dots.
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole thing about social media, is that it put everybody on a level playing platform.
Right.
Whether you're an expert in this field is now having to argue with Yahoo, who dropped out of college, you dropped out of high school barefoot and pregnant. Apologies to anybody who dropped out of high school for getting pregnant. But that's what it's basically boiled down to. We've seen this on a number of issues, particularly, if you look at the anti-vax movement is the best example I could think of. You have physicians and doctors and experts on social media arguing with people who failed their high school science class.
Sure.
And everybody's on the same level playing field. In some ways, it's the death of expertise. And there was a great quote from a British politician around the time of the Brexit vote saying, as people were predicting what is now starting to come to pass with Britain having left the EU, it was being predicted as the Brexit vote was going to happen. And then after it occurred, with people saying, we have to stop this, we have to turn the ship around. And I can't remember which Tory politician in the UK stood up and said, people are tired of hearing from experts of how things are going to be, and they want to decide their fate for themselves.
Yeah.
And I think that is a lot of it, that everybody wants to feel that we have control over our, at least our little sphere of the world, if not the larger thing.
Right.
People don't like the idea that things happen to them. Mm-hmm. Nobody wants to be, forgive me for this analogy, nobody wants to be the NPC in a game.
Right.
Most of us are, for a lack of a way of putting it. Most of us, for as much as we kind of go about our daily routines and lives, we like to think of ourselves as the active participant in our lives, that we're the person defining things the most. And the reality is that's often not the case. As a great meme I saw several years ago on social media said, we're all the NPC in somebody else's game. And I think most of us have a hard time accepting that as a reality.
Mm-hmm. For most people,
we all want to be the center of the universe.
Yeah. For most everyone on Earth except yourself, you're the NPC. But then, and so everyone's trying to. I don't see how, because this issue of what is canon and what isn't is basically the same problem of like, who is the authority, who's a trustworthy expert, who isn't. And I don't see how you ever, in this day and age with this technology, ever solve that problem.
We may not be able to.
I think the problem spirals more and more out of control.
What I tend to think will happen, and this may be me, and this may be me being an optimist or a pessimist. I'm not sure which, frankly. What I tend to think will happen is that there's going to be something that will eventually reset the wheel, as it were. We're going to end up back on some kind of a track. What that track is going to be, I have no earthly idea. But what often happens in my experience as a historian looking at things, albeit an armchair one, is that you can stand up and you can say things all you want and you can reject reality all you want, but eventually reality is going to smack you in the face. Mm-hmm. And you're not going to be able to ignore the issue any further. And what happens when that day comes, what happens on that day for that matter, I have no earthly idea.
Yeah.
It's something that gives me hope, but it's also something that also slightly terrifies me because it could go any which way.
I think the internet has to have there has to be, or maybe there doesn't, maybe or maybe we learn from the past where people were trying to interweave all their apocrypha together into a grand unified theory of because that's sort of what everyone is creating their own apocrypha of what's happening.
Yeah.
And the world. And we need to, and maybe the way forward is okay, how do we unify them all? Even the crazy stories, because otherwise everyone is, you're going to have these constant, you can't put it together. It's going to constantly spin off.
Yeah. I mean, you could argue to some extent, if you look at what's happened with QAnon since the beginning of the year.
I love QAnon. It's fascinating.
It's a bizarre thing, and it would be hilarious in a different context.
Uh-huh.
But you think about, I was reading an article not too long ago about, the people who were camped out in Dallas not too long ago, waiting for JFK or JFK Jr. or both to suddenly pop up in Dealey Plaza. Right. And it's,
how great would it have been if they did? That would have been amazing.
It would have been the plot twist to end all plot twists.
Right.
And you can look at it from a distance and be hilarious, but then you start reading, as I did, an article about people are having to cut off their spouses' credit cards because they're sitting there running hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, staying in hotels and traveling the country with no job and everything else. And recognizing that there are real world consequences to some of this stuff.
Yeah. And I think it's because the story of, again, their headcanon of the story of how the country works.
Yeah.
Doesn't match what's happening. And so you get this, and if that happens too much, then society just falls apart.
Right.
So, yeah. And so, but if there's no authorship, then there's no, and everyone's the same. It's this giant quagmire.
Yeah. I mean, part of it, as I said, it's always existed. There's always been a fringe, for lack of a better way of putting it. What's happened is that the fringe has moved into the mainstream. They've been given, the internet has given them a giant megaphone, for lack of a better way of putting it. It used to be they'd stand out on your street corner with a sign going, repent, the end is nigh. Now they can do it on social media to tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of followers. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It wasn't that long ago. Let's talk about the 2012 phenomenon for that example. When millions of people around the world were utterly convinced 2012 was going to be the end of the world. And people were debating exactly what it was going to be. Were we going to get sucked into a black hole? Was it going to be, tectonic plate displacement? A la the Roland Emmerich film. Everybody had their own ideas. What happened there was that when December 21st, 2012 rolled around and nothing happened, one of two things happened. People kicked the can down the road a bit further.
Right.
Or they got on with their lives and they kind of went, dear God, how could we ever believe this nonsense?
Uh-huh.
And, we could argue the same things happening at the moment with QAnon, though I think QAnon, because of the fact that it was, if you really kind of examine it, it sort of incorporates so many other conspiracy theories
Yes, it was a grand unified conspiracy theory.
Yeah, it'll keep going. It's gonna mutate into God knows what variant, and it's gonna keep going.
I think it's fantastic. It's crazy.
from a storytelling point of view, and as somebody who has an interest in conspiracy theories and some belief in a handful, I will admit, as we've talked about before, particularly JFK and some of the ufology stuff. From that point of view, it's fascinating. On the other hand, as we saw with Guy walking into a pizza parlor in DC a few years ago and shooting the place up because he thought that there were, kidnapped sex slave children in its basement in a building that didn't have a basement.
But see, here's the problem. But then Jeffrey Epstein was real, and they killed him. And people are like, well, but it's true. So like, there's obviously things not being said, and people are like, well, there's all these floating dots now. Like, they're asking the Washington, like, well, what about Jeffrey Epstein and the weird sex island? And everyone's like, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, that becomes the problem in some respects, is that the real world doesn't make sense.
Exactly. It doesn't.
The real world doesn't make sense. Again, that Tom Clancy quote, the difference between fact and fiction is that fiction has to make sense.
Right.
Real life often doesn't. People do things for no reason, or they do things on whims.
Yeah.
And again, what conspiracy theories more often than not do, at least in my view, is they put a narrative on the narrative list. A lot of them are attempts to make sense out of chaos. And, that's fundamentally what canon, whether it's religion or it's in a fandom, that's what it's there to do. It's to take the disparate dots and to put them together into a story that more people than not can hopefully agree on. And if you don't agree on that version of things, you can go off and start your own thing. What's changed, as we were talking about, is that, our big stories these days, are science fiction franchises, they're comic books things, they're, Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, Doctor Who, Marvel, DC, you name it. They're owned by somebody else. Right. And I think what's been lost, and this may be in some ways, I think the rise of particularly some of these big conspiracy theories, the big conspiracy theories, again, going back to QAnon, Q hasn't made a drop in a year or so at this point. Right. But people are adding their own stuff to it. The JFK thing, for example. Yeah,
they just are pretending that they're Q now.
Yeah. And that's part of it. In some ways, it's storytelling in its most purest form. What's happened is that our big stories today aren't owned by us anymore. They're owned by somebody else who can dictate what is and what isn't. Right. And we get very upset when we're told that our version of things don't line up with their version of things. Right.
Bitcoin is like that too. Like, there's this whole mythos of Bitcoin because like the founder's anonymous. Who knows who he is? Anyone could be him. I could have the secret message from Satoshi or whatever.
Right.
And so that's like, but also like even the big stories, like say, like the Matrix I brought up, like the whole premise of the Matrix is that the world presented to you is fake.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's like a mainstream idea now. That like the whole thing is a made up artifice. And that itself is one of the mainstream stories, is that the mainstream story is not true.
Yeah. So well, art imitates life, and life imitates art. Yeah. And eventually they become indistinguishable from one another. There's a wonderful phrase I came across that Robbie Grant used in his book, Silver Screen Saucers, talking about the way that people associate elements of ufology with pop culture rather than a real phenomenon. And it's a term from psychology known as hypernormalization. And it's the idea that if you feed the brain enough sensations, you feed it with enough images, enough sound, that you can overload the brain, and the brain can't tell what's real and what isn't. And I tend to think, perhaps as a society at large, and particularly in certain corners of it, I think that's what's happened. Again, there's a great line, as Adam from Mythbusters once said, "I reject your reality and substitute it with my own."
Right.
And we're seeing that happen on a mass scale. Right. Part of it through people who've had their worldview, who have their worldviews challenged and don't like what the world has to say back to them. Part of it is people who just see that there's a way to profit off of it, whether that's through political office or selling books or getting people to listen to your podcast and paying you money for ads.
Right.
A lot of it, the world has always been a cynical place. The problem is that thanks again to social media, not only can people reach out across their fields of madness to infect each other, they can exploit people doing it at the same time.
Right. Yeah, I reject your realities. But reality is a story, though. That's the thing.
Yeah.
And so this argument about this is why the fandom thing is like a microcosm of what we're doing at large.
Oh, yeah. And that's a good way of putting it. I mean, the argument, I've said before, ufology, for example, it seems to be about 20 to 30 years ahead of everybody else. In the 50s and 60s, they were already talking about we can't trust the government. The government's hiding information. Right. And the public at large said, well, that doesn't make any sense. And then, of course, in the 70s and 80s, we get Watergate. We get the revelations of what the CIA and the FBI have been doing for decades.
Yeah,
around country.
They are doing mind control.
Yeah,
that's the crazy. It's like, no, they are though.
But and again, there's kernels of truth in that.
Yeah.
That ends up being blown up into they're doing all sorts of things. The CIA had a relationship with various journalists and whatnot from the 1950s all the way into the late 60s, when the media at large basically went, yeah, nobody's buying this crap anymore. We're not going to keep reporting it. And that ended decades ago, but that's morphed into the idea that the CIA is controlling the mainstream press to say bad things about the right wing.
Right. Well, and you were talking about the UFO thing being 30 years ahead. What I've noticed is about 20 years, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or something, the UFO field started to shift subtly from maybe they're not aliens, maybe they're like spirit beings.
Oh, part of the UFO field did.
And I see that cropping up in the politics and the mainstream, like, oh, they're being controlled by demons and whatnot.
Yeah.
And so
again, that's always been on the fringes. Joe Bronson, I think it is, wrote a wonderful book called The Men Who Stare at Goats.
Yeah, great book.
Great book. Turned into a good film, but a film that doesn't necessarily resemble the reality that Bronson was writing about. But one of the things he talks about there is when the military and the CIA were doing their remote viewing experiments. There were senators and whatnot who found out about it, were the ones responsible for doing it, who believed in demons and all of that.
Yeah.
And believed in some stuff that we would consider to be fairly out there, at least in my book. Mm-hmm. But they were the ones who controlled the purse strings on things.
Right.
And there's an argument that's been made now in ufology that those are the same, the control of those kinds of people over the purse strings of things is part of why we've not gotten any closer to a solution in decades to what this might be. In some ways, is because they view it and go, "Oh God, it's angels and demons, and we need to leave that. We need to leave that the bleep alone, rather than viewing it as something else." Now, whether again, your mileage may vary, as the kids say, but I think that a lot of that controls it and it's the same thing. You were talking about fandom as a microcosm. You think about whoever's controlling Doctor Who at the moment or whatever, Star Trek. And you could argue that that's true too when it comes to some of this more nebulous phenomenon out there, that whoever is controlling the research money that goes into looking at those things controls what they are. I think it's part of the reason why there's been such a strong narrative in particularly mainstream media on the UFO field that it's all weather balloons, swamp gas, misidentified things. It can't possibly be anything else. What do you
think about the recent revelations in New York Times and stuff where the Navy's like, oh yeah, no, UFOs are real?
I welcome it. It's been fascinating. And that was actually the next thing I was going to get to.
Yeah.
Was the way that narrative has only just now finally broken down. Right. It's starting to. It's parts of it are still there. Neil deGrasse Tyson on Twitter, Mick West with his hypersonic seagulls.
Right.
The part of that is there. Of course, there's also people who would probably think that I'm crazy for thinking that any of that's real as well. But again, it's based on perceptions of reality. But also, 500 years ago or so, the idea that the Earth was not the center of the solar system, let alone the universe,
right,
was enough to burn you at the stake.
Yeah,
so there is, ideas shift over time, along with everything else. The continent shift, ideas shift. What is radical and out there at in 1 year, 1 decade, 1 century can come back into vogue and be explored upon and proven in another time. And that's the same thing with fandom. It's the evolution of storytelling as well. Reality evolves as we come to understand it. There's, our image of the universe today is a very strange one, with black holes and big crunches and dark matter and things that we legitimately don't understand. At the same time, the people promoting those ideas look at the idea of UFOs, say, and laugh at it.
Right.
Because it doesn't fit into their preconceived notions of reality. You can't travel faster than the speed of light, or relativistic travel is just unrealistic. To be fit, in 250 years ago or so, the idea that human beings could travel in a train at over 30 miles an hour would kill them.
Right.
And that was the accepted mainstream wisdom. Things are that way until they suddenly aren't. And it's getting to the point where the paradigm shifts. That's the hard part. And going back to Doctor Who, which kind of started off this whole conversation, when the idea that there were only 12 lives and 13 regenerations, and that the Doctor was a Time Lord from Gallifrey, caused uproar in infant Doctor Who fandom. There's a famous essay written by one of the big names in fandom at the time called "Whatever Happened to the Magic of Doctor Who," and you can Google it. You can read it today.
Yeah.
And it reads like some of the diatribes that you could read now about the current era of the show, or indeed the last era of the show, or indeed the one before that. It
probably reads like, "What happened to America? What the good old America?" Yeah, it's same thing.
It's the same thing. Nostalgia is a dangerous thing.
Yeah,
it's the idea that the past was somehow better than the present.
Right.
It's often, I think, it's born out of the thing that we remember things from our childhood, but we also have to remember that as a child, you also don't have to worry about bills and keeping a roof over your head and where's the next meal coming from, because somebody else has done that for you. Everything instinctively seems simpler in that respect. It's when people talk about nostalgia for the 1950s and everything else. It's like, well, sure, the 1950s is great, except for, polio and a lack of internet and, all these,
the Cold War
and the Cold War. And, all these amenities that you take for granted don't exist yet.
Right.
You really think you would be comfortable back in that time?
Right.
That may be slightly political, but it's one of those things. Nostalgia, weaponized nostalgia in particular, can be employed for devastating effect. We see that in fandoms. We see that in our culture at large.
Right. Yeah, but I think it's also that it's rooted in like the nostalgia is like a set canon in your head.
Yeah.
Of the way things are. And then like when that gets overturned, you're like, well, now I don't understand what we're even doing.
Yeah.
But yeah. Well, anyway, thank you for doing this.
You're welcome.
It's very nice. Thank you for the short notice. Is there anything new you're working on? Any new books or anything that's coming out? Where can people find you?
Well, I had my novel come out back in May.
You finished it?
Yeah, well, I had already finished it. I had been sitting on it for a while, and you were one of the people I talked to last year who told me this is the thing you need to go and do something with next. So I did, and it came out. It came out in May. You can buy it on Kindle now.
Oh, what is it called?
It's called Our Man on the Hill. It's an alternate.
Yeah.
It's an alternate history Cold War spy thriller premised on the idea that Joe McCarthy, the most infamous Red Hunter of the Cold War period, was actually working for the Soviets all along.
Yeah.
Speaking of turning things on their head,
I saw that book. I thought that was an actual like historical book you had written, not a fiction work.
A buddy of mine, tried to convince me to go back and rewrite it as a nonfiction book. Yeah. And he said you'd sell a lot more copies of it.
I said, pretend it's nonfiction.
Right.
Make it a conspiracy book. You'd sell so many more.
Well, you can read the book between the lines, because I made a big effort to incorporate real historical events and things that were said. So you can read it as kind of the secret history of Joe McCarthy, U.S. Senator. Right. So that's available now. You can get it on Kindle through Amazon. It's out from a company in the UK called Sea Lion Press. The Dark Skies book that we were talking about earlier came out last April. It's available from Obverse Books, looking at that 1990 series. And I've recently been nominated for what's known as the Sidewise Award for alternate history for a short story and an anthology that came out last year called Alternate Australias. My story, Moonshot, deals with a Anglo-Australian moon mission gone wrong in an alternate 1960s. Cool. You can pick that up on Kindle now as well. I get paid royalties for all of those. Please go buy them. It's the only way I'm making money as a writer at the moment. You can also check out a lot of my review writing on warpfactor.com.
Cool. Well, thank you again for doing this.
Well, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure.
It was fun. Yeah, thank you. All right.
Targets up here, we just had something go right over the top of us that, I hate to say this, looked like a long cylindrical object that almost looked like a cruise missile type of thing moving really fast and went right over the top of us.